The main character, a girl with bright red hair and green eyes, has the name Lucifella, and she is a powerful, evil witch who is what is known as the disaster of the continent. Lucifella, a witch with limitless powers of fire and ice, also has 6 devoted minions who have followed her into a world of evil and chaos. The terrible witch Lucifella has been a cruel and ruthless child since she was a child. Already at the age of 15, she destroyed the empire that stood against her. But then war broke out because of her, and calamity settled on her heart. Archvedma Lucifella, who knew no bounds, continued to increase the number of her subjects. When Lucifella's subordinates appeared, the people of the continent always thought that a real demon had descended from the heavens to them. The unfortunate people prayed to the gods for salvation because humanity was on the verge of extinction, and in an instant, a light shone above them. People realized that before them appeared the hero they had long dreamed of and needed. This hero, who had blonde, long hair and a long staff with light-colored clothing, was the Holy Father of Esperia. Holy Father Esperia became a ray of hope to save all of humanity and the continent from the forces of evil. This war soon led to a battle between Saint Esperia and the dark forces. The confrontation between the forces of evil and good lasted 5 years, and only after the death of the witch Lucifella, darkness agreed to sign a peace treaty. Thus, the war between darkness and light ended with the victory of good 50 years later. The archivist died tragically. In one quiet room, an old man was writing his book with a red quill while looking at the portrait of the Holy Father of Esperia, the hero of the continent. But the silent and industrious, bearded old man in beautiful robes, who continued to write, was interrupted by another voice that called out to him, calling him Archbishop Bachman. The other voice belonged to a short-haired subject who told Bachman that the Holy Father was calling everyone to him. Hearing this, Archbishop Bachman's right hand, with which he was writing a book, trembled. He looked at his subject with a kind of sadness and longing and said that this time had come. Only in one room in the whole palace was the light burning on the fateful night, and to these chambers old man Bachman had already arrived to catch an important and tragic moment in the history of the continent. In the luxurious chambers on a bed lay the Holy Father, the hero of humanity, who was groaning heavily in pain, stretching his hand to the ceiling and calling to himself in death to a certain holy goddess, Esperia. Archbishop Bachman, as well as all others present, watched with pain and tears as the Holy Father died, saying that the goddess had not yet left them. The Holy Father, living the last moments of his heroic life, stretched out his hand toward the ceiling on which was painted the divine and incredible, the holy goddess he was muttering about. The hero of the continent said that the goddess was bound to appear, whereupon, at the moment of the appearance of a great lightning bolt, he cried out that they must urgently find the Holy Child, the new hero of the continent and of all mankind. The subjects watched with horror and tears as their continent's main hero died while speaking his last words about the Holy Child, the hero of humanity. Saint Father Esperia's pale and old hand sank exhaustedly onto the bed as he warned everyone one last time to find the Holy Child. The Holy Father left this world, leaving a final admonishment. After the death of the Holy Father, Archbishop Bachman spoke to the others about what was left for them to do. They thought that something terrible would happen if the bearers of calamities knew about the Holy Father's death right now. So Archbishop Bachman, along with the others, decided to delay announcing the death of the Holy Father until they could find the child. One of the subordinates told Bachman that even if the Holy Father had ordered them to find this child, they had no clue where to find him. But then, while the Archbishop was listening to his aide, he felt the first drop of the beginning rain fall on his nose. Archbishop Bachman looked sadly up into the sky, where the rain was already pouring down. A subordinate who was standing nearby informed Bachman that she would bring him an umbrella and left to fetch it. Bachman stood under the sky and watched the raindrops and thought that even the sky shared with them the sorrow for the loss of the Holy Father of Esperia, if such a heavy and incessant downpour poured down on the earth. But suddenly, Archbishop Bachman's sadness was interrupted by the loud and desperate crying of a child, which seemed to come from a nearby bush. The Archbishop rushed out to search for the child over the cries, spitting rain, heavy downpour, and stepping on puddles. The bearded priest came running to a place that was illuminated with a bright golden light, and this incomprehensible phenomenon came from a fountain that was in a garden among the trees. What the archbishop saw shocked him, for in the basket was illuminated a crying child who had an incredible beauty of golden hair and snow-white skin. The mysterious child opened its beautiful violet eyes, and then Archbishop Bachman realized that the prophecy the Holy Father had spoken of had come true. Bachman gently crouched down beside the child, calling it Saint and holding out his hands to the girl. With tears in her eyes, Bachman said they were all very much looking forward to her coming. Archbishop Bachman reached out his palms to the girl to take the little girl in his arms, but he had no idea that the seemingly innocent, crying little girl would dislike it very much. The little white-haired girl slapped her foot on the good archbishop's face, trying to shout for the bearded old man to get away. Old man Bachman called the girl Saint, because that name can only belong to the incarnation of a goddess who occupies a place higher even than the Holy Father. The incarnation of the goddess would save their continent and humanity from evil. While the little girl was kicking the archbishop in the face with her feet and hands, Bachman realized that now they were not afraid even of the witch Lucifella and her servants, because the holy goddess would protect them in any situation. But at that moment, the little holy child realized that he had been reborn, for before in this world he had been none other than the very powerful Archbishop Lucifella. The servants and the archbishop brought the holy girl to the palace, while a woman told them that the holy goddess Asperia had sent them the saint after all, and the prophecy had been fulfilled. The woman went on to say that only a God's messenger could have violet-colored eyes, and that her hair was exactly like the goddess's, light gold. The main character frowned her eyebrows at everyone present. The white-haired old woman looked at the holy girl with joy and proclaimed that the little girl was now definitely blessed by the goddess. One cheerful subordinate with bright red hair and beard exclaimed that the blessing would now be given to everyone on their continent and beyond. While the tall red-haired man, along with the smiling archbishop, looked at the holy child, the kind woman happily thanked the little girl for visiting them. The holy child sat on a cushion with anger and discontent, watching everyone who said simple words of thanks to him. He couldn't speak yet, but in his mind he was furious that this was all wrong. The chosen child who is raging at everyone present is actually named Lucifella. She remembers the many lives she has had the opportunity to live on this earth. In one of her lives, she managed to live the life of a noble and aristocratic princess of a country that everyone kissed her hand, respected, and loved. But Lucifella was also lucky enough to live not only a luxurious life of fame and fortune, but also the life of a simple, will-less slave who was put on display with his hands tied. Lucifella also recalls that she reincarnated and in different animals, for example, as a bird, deer, frog, or even a fish. She was incredibly fed up with this incessant, vicious cycle of life and death that she tried to destroy the world to stop the existing cycle of nature. Evil Lucifella, being in the body of a holy child, became even more angry at everyone and screamed, realizing that she would have to live another life in the body of an incomprehensible goddess. She wondered why, after more than 100 life cycles, she had been born again in this very body. Archbishop Bachman, noticing the bright light emitted by the holy girl, who, in fact, literally glowed with anger, rejoiced, telling others that it was such light inherent in the holy goddess. The protagonist got even angrier when she remembered that she was actually an atheist. Besides, no matter how much time passed, she could not forget one person she sees in front of her. That person is Archbishop Bachman, whom Lucifella encountered during the battle with the saints. At the time Lucifella lived, he was referred to as the Holy Shield. Though Lucifella recognizes her longtime enemy, she wonders when he had time to age so much to have a long beard and wrinkles all over his face. The witch Lucifella, being in the body of a holy child, realized that she can't even guess how much time has passed since her birth and how her longtime comrades, with whom she fought against the forces of good, are doing. The protagonist doesn't even know how their last war ended. But then, while the protagonist was worrying about her past life, the holy little girl was approached by a white-haired woman who had the courage to reach out her arms to Lucifella and place her on her bed. Kind to the protagonist, the white-haired woman with a cross around her neck informed Lucifella that they would prepare a new diaper for her right away. While the woman was changing the holy girl's diaper, also using powder, Lucifella was screaming at everyone, trying to tell everyone to get away from her, not to touch her, because they don't even know who she really is. From bright anger, the protagonist, imprisoned with the body of a holy baby, began to sob, thinking that she would definitely take revenge on them for all of this as soon as she regained her all-powerful powers. Spilling all the negative emotions outward, the protagonist fiercely swore that she would kill every last one of them, because she was not just a holy child, but the great arch-rival Lucifella, who was able to wreak havoc on the continent. It was a deafening night in the palace, and the protagonist was able to sleep soundly, having drunk milk beforehand. Falling asleep in her arms, the white-haired woman assumed that the girl was very tired since she was able to fall asleep so quickly. The servants put the girl to sleep in a small crib, talking about how as long as other people didn't know about the saint's birth, it would be better for them to continue not knowing about it to keep the baby safe from potential danger. Archbishop Bachman said that they needed to protect the holy girl properly, for the forces of evil were still alive and wanted to destroy not only her, but all of humanity. But a red-haired man interrupted the archbishop with his own words. The bearded man with motivation told Bachman to simply fulfill his duties, for they, along with the guards and servants, would protect the saint so that no one would dare to lay a finger on her. The man with the red beard also wanted to add some more words to the archbishop, but he was interrupted by the one who had come to them, which caused the bearded man to turn around and tell the one who had appeared that he had come just in time. The archbishop and the red-haired man were looked at by an equally red-haired boy with bright eyes and unusual eyebrows. He stared at everyone until the bearded man alerted those present that this was his son, George IV. The man also added that his son was not only smart for his age, but also very talented. In addition, according to the bearded man, the blood of the Paladin family flows in him. The boy really looks a lot like his father. The white-haired old woman and the archbishop greeted the little boy with a smile, and the woman also confessed that this child would accompany their holy child. Bachman shared that he was very young. The red-haired boy appeared a bit shy and withdrawn, so his dad asked George IV to introduce himself. The shy boy did not say anything, but merely bowed before the archbishop and the woman, listening to his papa's words that he was not very sociable yet. But the boy thought about his father being a liar. While the red-haired man was cheerfully talking to Archbishop Bachman, the little boy kept thinking that he had only come here because of his father, and he wasn't really interested in protecting the holy girl in any way. The red-haired boy looked at the sleeping holy girl and realized that she was just a child. He doesn't understand why he should be in the business of guarding her. The boy looked at the sleeping little girl with anger, and thus reassured himself to just wait and watch her as his father had told him, and when he grew up, he would take charge of his own life and obey no one but himself. The boy vowed to himself to sever ties with this house forever. Meanwhile, in the lair of evil at a game of chess, they were already discussing the fact that most likely, as the prophecy said, the saint had returned after all. One dark villainess with green hair, rearranging the queen piece on the chessboard with her magic, confessed that she wished very much for the death of the annoying old man, meaning the Holy Father of Hesperia. Another dark silhouette sitting at the table holding the queen's chess piece asked the green-haired villainess about her narrow-minded thoughts. With his dark magic, the mysterious villain, being in great anger, cracked the queen chess piece, spelling out that the sprout that was planted ended up becoming a tree and needs to be cut down before it becomes a problem. The cunning villains talk about the Holy Child. The green-haired villainess decided to further spell out the fact that thus the Holy Father died, and because of his prophecy, a saint came into existence. But at this point, she was interrupted by the laughter of the underling next to her. The antagonist interrupted her speech and looked at her friend with her angry and crazed eyes, wondering what made him laugh so much at her words. When her hilarious friend, who had blonde hair and heels on his feet, couldn't even calm down from laughing, the villainess asked him another question about whether he dared to mock her now. As the laughter continued to emanate from the charismatic, white-haired guy, he told his friends his opinion about being so sad about the future, as if they weren't strong enough to basically deal with it. The blonde-haired guy continued talking, adding a poignant phrase for everyone that now even their queen was gone. This made the green-haired girl get so angry at the guy that large veins of anger protruded on her face, and from the looks of it, she was ready about to kill him. The villainess stood up from her seat and prepared to destroy her offender with her personal green magic, and threatened him, asking him why he had mentioned the queen in his words. The white-haired guy also prepared himself for a possible battle by activating his magical powers. But the mystical and calm man sitting on a chair between the two furious mages suddenly ordered everyone to stop the conflict they had started. The man sitting relaxedly on the throne said that their role was to protect this place if the holy girl ever returned. And what good would they get out of an argument between a green-haired villainess and a blonde man? That question caused the witch and the mage to interrupt the conflict. Calling the blonde man Jack, the mysterious man told him to destroy the saint, to which the charismatic blonde Jack said nothing. Deciding not to object, Jack moved towards the exit, saying that he already wanted to do it, and if they all thought it was so important, he could do it as quietly as possible. Stepping gracefully on his heels on his way out to fulfill his new assignment, Jack told everyone with a smile that he was leaving. And to his mysterious friend who interrupted their argument and gave him the assignment, Jack told him to take care of the queen, calling the mysterious guy Crom. Meanwhile, the protagonist has a believable and interesting dream. In front of her stands a young Archbishop Bachman with a magical staff in his hand, who tells her that in all these days she has not made any progress in her endeavors. He asks Lucifella if she still wants to learn magic from him. The small, weak, and poor protagonist with short red hair replies to Bachman that she is burning to learn magic. Her teacher immediately answers her with a question, asking her why she has the desire to learn the continent's magic, and the poor girl answers him because she has a desire and is eager to fulfill it. Her teacher was silent upon hearing the little heroine's confession and then asked her what her name was, but the orphan girl answered that she had no name. The kind and wise Archbishop Bachman, putting his hand on the orphan girl's shoulder, said that in that case the name of the protagonist is Lucifella. With those words, the Archbishop led the orphan Lucifella to his temple, explaining that her new name now meant light. At this point, the little protagonist woke up in the middle of the night from an impressive dream and prepared to cry as she pondered what she had dreamed. While in her little crib, the holy girl realized that she was once again having this strange dream that had that teacher in it. Lucifella recalls that she learned how to properly control magic not immediately. The girl tried for a long time over it, being an ordinary child with red hair. For example, the girl tried to summon a magical bird using ashes and magic. But thanks to one man who gave her the name Lucifella, she was able to master magic and sorcery instantly. The bearded teacher always helped the girl with her sorcery. Thanks to that one time, the girl was able to summon a magical stone phoenix that appeared before her and the teacher. The wizard was for Lucifella the person who looked after her as a member of the family and the person who showed her what true happiness was. But at the same time, despite the fact that the teacher was a dear person to her who steered her destiny in the right direction, the Archbishop was also the man who destroyed her happy world. And it was her native teacher, Archbishop, who gave her precious knowledge in magic and witchcraft, who made her the worst witch on the continent. The protagonist admits that she has already forgotten that she was reborn and is in the body of a child, but she still cannot forget her past lives. This makes her clench her palm into a fist. The holy girl suddenly remembers that what she tried to get in her past life in Hesperia, she must find now, being in a new, young form. She wants to find the treasure hidden in Hesperia. There is so much motivation in the little girl that she's ready to crawl out and start searching for her treasure right now, so Lucifella is determined that she will search the entire palace starting tomorrow. Thus came the next clear day that reigned over the palace and where the protagonist was, along with the Archbishop and other personalities. Already from the morning, almost all the servants of the sacred palace had been admiring the holy little girl, exclaiming joyfully that a saint had been sent to them to protect them from calamities. But then George IV, who was just passing by the maids, happened to overhear their conversation, in which the two maids were talking about a mysterious messenger from Runebelt, a pervert who could not be understood. The maids called the mysterious messenger a pervert for the reason that he had been chopping wood with his bare torso since morning and showing off in front of everyone. But this was not enough for the pervert, and he molested the servants who brought food, kissing their hands and saying various things to them. One worried servant girl said that if they did not confess, something irreparable would happen. But at the same time, the maid wondered if he might be a holy messenger. George IV continued to listen to the servant girl's gossip about the pervert, which ended with the fact that he could not be a holy messenger because, according to one servant, his appearance and behavior did not befit it, But abruptly, George was interrupted by his own father. Calling to his son, the red-haired, bearded man told Georg to follow him. After the appearance of the Holy Girl, the death of the Holy Father, who was a former hero of Vesperia, was announced to everyone, and many messengers came to the continent to express their condolences for what had happened. Among them was also a messenger of calamity from Ronebelt, but George IV was still thinking about the mysterious pervert who looked rather strange to the boy's opinion. Soon the little boy, together with his papa, came to a door that led to a room with the Holy Girl's crib. At this point, the boy's red-haired father stopped, causing Georg to wonder why he wasn't entering the room. It turns out that the boy's father had tearfully contemplated their fate and said that it looked like the goddess hadn't left them yet. Georg's father added that from the day their ancestors betrayed the saints, he thought they would never again be able to peel away the stigma of traitors. With tears in his eyes, the red-haired man placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, saying that the goddess had given them a second chance to reform. The father asked the boy not to let them fall face down in the dirt in front of the goddess again. Little George dutifully agreed to his father's words, but in his mind, he was negatively surprised by his father's faith in the goddess, which, in places, irritated the young boy. But when father and son entered the room where the saint was to be, unexpectedly for both of them, they found that the child was not in the crib. George IV immediately began searching for the missing saint until he saw her out of the corner of his eye, and what he saw made him incredibly surprised. The Holy Girl was able to leave the crib without much trouble and run towards the exit. Luciferia, meanwhile, was thinking about how her escape was successful and how she needed to move quickly, because it would be difficult for her to reach the handle she wanted to push and open the door. But the saintly little girl's escape was interrupted by a brave boy she spotted in her field of vision. Turning around, Lucifella noticed the red-haired child chasing after her, who was just standing by the door. The protagonist hoped that he hadn't noticed her, but that turned out to be far from the case. George IV was able to catch the girl with no problem, grabbing her by her clothes and lifting her off the floor, making the protagonist silently furious. Clenching her right palm into a tight fist, Lucifella asked Georg in her mind if he seriously thought he had caught her. And after that, the Holy Girl's fist flew into the face of the uncomprehending red-haired boy. The unfortunate George even fell down from such a blow, and his forehead was left with a red mark from the infant's fist, who was actually pleased with his work, judging by the expressed smile on his face. While the little boy tried to recover from the pain, the Holy Girl, who is actually Lucifella, crawled further into her business, namely, the door. Lucifella thought for sure she would make it out, but she wouldn't come back here. George IV decided to call the girl to him kindly, holding out his arms to her and telling her to crawl to him, but the saintly little girl still had other plans. But little Lucifella, determined to teach George a lesson, looked at the boy with her malicious and cunning gaze, asking him in her mind what could be so interesting beyond this room. Immediately afterward, the saint flew to the door, dazing Georg with her speed and eagerness to leave the room as soon as possible. Georg began to shout to the little protagonist to stop immediately, but of course she listened to no one. While the girl bravely ran to the exit, she gloatingly thought to herself that if Georg thinks that she is an obedient child who obeys everyone, he is deeply mistaken. At this point, the girl was in for a surprise. As it turned out, there was a ladder in the way of the Holy Girl, which the little girl had not even realized. In addition, she realized what George IV was trying to warn her about. While the holy little girl was screaming in shock, trying to tell everyone that she was about to die in the fall, little George was rushing towards her with all his might to save the clumsy child. The servants who were lucky enough to witness this scene did not pay attention at first, but it was only when they noticed that a holy child, a hero who had been sent by the goddess to protect mankind, was falling down the stairs that they were stunned by what was happening, to say the least. As the holy girl flew over the heads of the stunned servants, George, also jumping, reached out his arms to the girl to catch her in midair and save her from a painful and possibly fatal fall. A look of shock appeared on the faces of the startled servants as they realized that they could now easily lose the saint who was the only hero to save the entire continent. In the end, George IV was able to catch the small and exuberant girl, but the boy himself had to fall painfully on his stomach while holding the little girl in his arms. The saint realized that if the industrious, red-haired boy hadn't caught her, she would now be quickly ending her 100th life, which scared her incredibly. But suddenly the guards, who were nearby and witnessed this impressive event, approached Georg and tied him up, mistakenly assuming that the boy had not saved her, but instead wanted to kill her. While the boy was trying to explain to the guards that it was all a mistake and they had it all wrong, the saintly little girl, who was picked up in their arms to be examined, began to caper furiously as well, trying to tell them that the guards were wrong. The maid who picked up the girl in her arms and examined her said the saint only got away with scratches on her knees. Meanwhile, Georg's father, who had been tied up by the guards, had also arrived at the scene of the shock. While the servants were already spreading the rumor that the boy had allegedly hurt the saint, the father watched in amazement as his son sat on his knees bound with a rope. The child's father approached him and sorrowfully proclaimed that it was better to let the guards punish him than his son, who in fact was not guilty of anything. The guards shouted that it was an unpardonable sin to attempt to kill a saint. A desperate George IV, who in no way wanted to see his father upset and distressed, sadly watched his father ask the guards to punish him rather than the little boy. While tears of regret came to Father George's eyes, the holy girl, Lucifella, who was in the arms of the maid, was watching intently and did not understand what was happening. She did not scream because she realized that everyone around her would not be able to understand her. The protagonist was thinking that this red-haired child would probably be executed, but at that moment her attention was attracted by an unusual man who also stood in the crowd and watched what was happening. Completely unexpectedly, the tragic event for Georg and his father was interrupted by a pleasant voice that asked everyone to listen to him, as someone who had seen everything that was happening from the beginning. While the maids were bewilderedly asking what he was doing here, Lucifella was recognizing the voice little by little. While the mysterious person was telling everyone that there had been some misunderstanding, the protagonist realized that no matter how many times she was reborn, she could still always recognize this person. After all, this blonde-haired and blue-eyed, generally pleasant but suspicious man is the lust mage of the Seven Scourges, Jack Casanova of Runabelt. Upon recognizing him, Archmage Lucifella, being in the body of a saint, wondered what he was doing here and what he wanted. Jack Casanova told those around him that that boy did not push the saint, but instead wanted to save the little girl from falling down the stairs, so he hurt himself. The main character watched Jack Casanova with disdain as he continued to convince everyone of the truth that the boy had saved the saint. While Jack was smiling sweetly, the servant holding the saint said suspiciously that let's say that was the case. At the same time, she thought, what is he prying for? Suddenly, the impostor Jack approached George IV, who was still sitting on his knees with his hands bound. Clearly plotting something, Jack Casanova began to tell all the servants that since they already wanted to kill him, why don't they do the following? Putting his hand to the boy's chin and looking him in the eye, Seducer Jack asked everyone present why they should not give George to him anyway. George IV was stunned to hear such bold words from the pervert, and everyone around him, including the boy's father, was also in incredible shock, not even knowing what to say. While the maid held Lucifella in her arms and did not want to let her go, angrily asking Jack why they should give him the boy, the protagonist already suspects Casanova in bad intentions, watching him closely. The mysterious seducer threw a promising look at Lucifella, by which you can understand only one thing. He is clearly guessing about something, but what exactly is not yet known. Lucifella in the body of a saintly little girl now wants to understand only what exactly the charismatic and mystical blonde needs, that he so persistently draws attention to himself and looks at her herself. Jack Casanova, putting his hands on his chest with sincerity, admitted that nothing can get in the way of love. The seducer also suggested a strategy to make everyone a prisoner of love and subdue them. The real Lucifella in the body of a saint listens as Jack Casanova wants to make everyone fall in love with him in order to get the boy. The protagonist remembers that he's always been that kind of person, but what exactly does he want here? The protagonist remembers that Jack, as a symbol of the sin of lust, loves to make family, romantic and even first sincere love, which he likes to amuse himself with. And in fact, he can make anyone fall in love with him. Jack once again asked everyone if they'd be better off putting that boy in his hands. The people around them clearly disagreed with Jack's decision, and the maid, who was holding Lucifella in the body of a holy girl, was the first to object to the seducer, but she didn't have time. She did not have time to say for the reason that Jack Casanova began to spread around his magic, love magic in the form of pheromones, so that all around fell in love with him and obeyed. Jack's magic didn't work on the little protagonist, but it did on the servants around her. The subject, who wanted to object to the seducer about Gorga, instantly changed her mind, being under the influence of love magic. Jack Casanova continues to seduce everyone around him to get what he desires. George IV, who at first wanted to be executed, Jack mesmerizes everyone with his looks and beauty. The exasperated protagonist Lucifella even covered her nose with her hands, thinking about how long it is possible to scatter around his pheromones with which Jack stupefies those around him. Lucifella noticed that almost all the servants are already gathered, and the seducer Jack has the attention of all the people, which he willingly uses. The protagonist assumes that Jack has not yet recognized her, because he focuses all his attention only on George IV and the surrounding subjects. But then the protagonist realized that if his magic extends to all the saints, which is what is happening now, and she is the arch-rival Lucifella, chained in the body of a saint, it means that Jack's magic will not work on her, and no one but her will be able to save George from execution. Lucifella in the body of a saint screamed and twitched, hinting that she needed something, which was immediately noticed by the servants. The servant girl lowered the protagonist to the floor, thinking she was uncomfortable in her arms. This turned out to be true, because the little girl stared intently at the seducer Jack, intending to do something with him. Jack Casanova turned his attention to the child, thinking that the little girl wanted to approach him. Sighing menacingly, the protagonist, being in the body of a holy baby, managed to stand on her feet the first time, trembling a little, which greatly surprised the servants and maids who were nearby. Determined and courageous, the holy girl fearlessly walked towards the seducer Jack, looking at him with formidable, angry, violet eyes. Jack Casanova even kneeled in front of the saint, extending her hands to apparently take in his arms when the baby comes even closer to him, but it turns out it was not necessary to do. But the protagonist was not afraid to pass by the seducer Jack because of what Casanova was both surprised and puzzled, because he was very much hoping that the little girl will approach him. It turned out that the little blonde-haired saint needed a boy, George, who was sitting on the floor with his hands tied with a rope. The girl approached him while the red-haired boy didn't realize exactly what the saint wanted to do to him. Piercing George IV with her angry gaze, the little girl thought and decided that the boy who blocked her path she would only help once. The little babe lay on George IV's lap, showing everyone that she didn't hate him, but instead wanted everyone to have mercy on him because he was kind. While Jack was looking at what was happening with questions, the servants were already in deep shock at the fact that the saint had gone to bed with him arbitrarily. One of the subjects shared his emotions that he was seeing this for the first time in his life. Lucifella, being in the saint's infant body, made herself comfortable on the red-haired boy's lap, thinking about how tired she was for the day. The servants concluded that the girl probably liked the boy very much. George IV was in great amazement, realizing that the saint, who a moment ago had slapped him in the face, was now coming to him herself and lay down on his lap to sleep. The servants reflected that the incarnation of the goddess had shown them that George was a good man, and that in such a case also the punishment should be abolished. The seducer, Jack, also put his hand to his chin, trying to figure out why the little girl needed it. But then Jack looked at the protagonist as if he realized something. Realizing something good, he continued to drill the saint with his blue eyes, which made Lucifella, who was in the saint's body, embarrassed. Eventually, though, George IV was accused of disobedience. He was forgiven of all his sins, as the saint lay in his lap and almost fell asleep. But in addition to being pardoned and forgiven of all sins, from that day forward, in the name of Father George III, George IV was appointed personal knight to the saintly girl. The hard day was finally coming to an end, and the little saint was already in her little crib as night fell. The servant wished Lucifella sweet dreams, making sure she fell asleep. After that, the servant left the girl alone. But for the pretend saint, this night was just the beginning for new adventures. Checking that she was alone in the room, she opened her eyes, about to make a second escape attempt. Saint began to carefully slide off the crib, getting ready to leave the room and glad that everyone had finally left her alone. Moving the chair large enough for her to reach the doorknob, Lucifella, in the body of a saint, reflected that, judging by the look in Jack's eyes, he recognized her after all. Moving her chair closer to the doorknob, the protagonist realized that she wanted to meet her seducer, Jack, but in order to do so, she needed to make sure no one noticed her this time, because the situation would be even worse. With great difficulty, the holy girl tried to climb up onto the chair, encouraging herself that this might be her, perhaps, last chance, which she should take while everyone was asleep. The little holy girl's hands reached for the doorknob, trying to grasp it, while the protagonist herself could barely hold on to the uncomfortable chair. But at this important point, someone dared to be the first to open the door from the other side, while the saint was trying to open the door herself. And, for this reason, not expecting such an event, the girl began to fall to the floor with outstretched hands with which she wanted to press the handle. The protagonist, in a state of shock, fell from the chair to the floor, not realizing how the door could open by itself at this moment, and how stupidly now will end her 101st life. And in one of the very last moments, the girl, who had already clutched herself with fear, felt how she was deftly lifted by the one whose fault it was that she was falling. Grasping her in his arms, the mysterious person held the girl securely in his palms. The little saint, realizing that the fall had passed her by, opened her violet eyes and looked at her savior, whom she had already seen somewhere. The savior held the heroine in his arms and asked her why she was so naughty. After eloquent phrases, the saint savior also added that he could not help but recognize in the image of the saint his queen, which he confessed to Lucifella. The saint is now certain that Casanova Jack recognized her, even if she is now in someone else's body. The holy babe tried to say hello to Jack, but her lips came out only inarticulate, incomprehensible cries of an ordinary child, which incredibly annoyed the protagonist because she could not say what she was thinking. Jack did not answer anything to his queen, but only put her back in the crib, while the heroine rejoiced that at last he appeared before her. The protagonist was greatly annoyed that she couldn't say something to her longtime friend Jack, who was at this time admiring her cuteness and beauty. Looking at his pretty queen, the seducer Jack decided to make a joke, saying that Lucifella's manner of speech has not changed, even though she was reborn, to which the saint angrily muttered something, trying to tell him not to make such a joke on her. The protagonist took a second attempt at saying something, trying to tell Jack why he was here, but when she again came out mumbling something she wanted to say she didn't mean it, the heroine got even more angry. Due to the fact that she has no way to adequately speak out, the protagonist went into a real rage, trying to say something so that Jack could understand her words. But it only took one snap of his fingers and a pinch of magic for his friend Jack to solve Lucifella's annoying speech problem in an instant. Thanks to just one snap of Jack's fingers, the saintly girl who contained Lucifella's soul was able to speak out, angrily saying that at this rate she would quickly go nuts trying to talk to anyone. While the protagonist realized that she had just managed to speak normal words for the first time, Jack Casanova immediately explained to her that he had borrowed her spirit power to do so. At the same time, the small, kind spirits from whom Jack had asked for help were already flying around him, the seducer telling the protagonist that spirits had always been his skate. Arch-rival Lucifella, being in the body of a saint, admitted to her friend that his manner of speech had not changed at all, to which Jack said with a smile that his manners had not changed as well as the heroine's inherent rudeness in conversation. In addition to the rudeness, Queen Lucifella said that she did not think that Jack himself would find her, although it's not a bad chance because, having been reborn, the protagonist wanted to use magic in this body, but now it is not possible only to radiate divine power, which she showed to the seducer. Jack decided to offer his condolences to the queen, saying that it must be hard for her in her new body. Lucifella took the chance to ask Jack again why he was here and if Crom had sent him here, to which Jack dubiously replied that he almost had. At this point, Jack confessed that he had come not just to check on her, but to take revenge on his enemies. Lucifella was surprised by such words, because the enemy for Jack is herself, who was reborn into a saint. The protagonist clarified Jack's seducer on this matter, asking if she was not the enemy he should eliminate here. Jack was surprised and asked the heroine if she even remembered the last events of her past life when she was queen. Lucifella tells Jack that she seems to remember the events of the last day of her past life, but each time she can't remember exactly her death. The heroine admits that these memories seem to have been erased from her memory intentionally. She remembers the last time she drank at a feast with her friends, before making a toast. Archived mother Lucifella remembers all the deaths she has experienced, but specifically her last death she can't remember, and it's very strange. She wonders why she was suddenly reborn in the body of a saint and what happened before she was born. Hearing such painful words for Jack, he covered his face with his hands and hunched over, crying heavily, saying that his queen really doesn't remember anything. Lucifella remained modestly silent. The main character lowered her violet eyes, telling the seducer Jack not to cry and just tell it like it is, because tears can't help grief. Lucifella once again told Jack to stop his tears and tell her what happened then. Jack looked at his queen, showing his tears and prepared to tell her the horrible tragedy. Jack began his painful tale by saying that before the most important battle on Saint Hesperia, an unknown man had dared to dispatch Archvedma Lucifella as she drank wine from a glass. Archvedma Lucifella recalls that on the last night before being dispatched to Holy Hesperia, she, along with the 7 sins, gathered together and raised their glasses to victory. In her speech, Lucifella remembered telling everyone that just yesterday their enemies had fallen to their knees before her and begged for forgiveness, but that all of them who were now gathered here were absolutely invincible. Lucifella remembers adding to those words that they will definitely leave here with victory this time as well. The protagonist made a toast while holding a glass of poison in her hands. While the sins of anger, lust, and envy listened intently to their archmage queen, Lucifella said that the hidden precious treasure would soon fall into the hands of their mages. And then, according to the archmage, they could all consider that victory was already in their pockets. With these words, the red-haired protagonist raised the glass that had, in fact, been the cause of her tragic death. Lucifella realized that this was the last memory she remembered from her past life. But the protagonist is still glad that despite her death, her followers have fulfilled her will. The protagonist decided to ask her friend Jack one more time about where her subjects were now, while a distraught sin of lust held his head and listened to his queen. The sad Jack Casanova decided to confess to arch-rival Lucifella that there were no longer 7 but 6 of them left. The saint listened attentively to her friend. Jack went on to say that about 50 years after the poisoning and death of the queen, they began to blame each other for not protecting their queen and missing precious time. Sin of lust recalls that at the time of the death of the arch-rival Lucifella, they were forced to immediately sign a peace treaty with the saints because they didn't want to be destroyed. And on this ground, the fiends had disagreements. The subjects quarreled among themselves, saying that in this situation, on the contrary, it was necessary to continue the war since the queen was gone, but others were against it. Some said that the queen must have been killed by the saints, but in that case, why didn't they destroy them completely if they know the queen is gone? But then one of the dark followers of Luciferia's arch-rival noticed one little noticed but incredibly important detail. The detail is that at the time of the fateful celebration together with the queen, there were only 6 of them. This fact became a small spark that turned into a conflagration of accusations and suspicions. Each of Lucifella's arch-rival's followers blamed each other for poisoning the queen, and he, in fact, the traitor. Some villains grabbed their heads and blamed themselves for not being able or thinking of protecting the queen at that important moment, but such villains were also claimed to look suspicious and look like traitors. The followers of the arch-rival would have continued to quarrel, begging each other for proof of their non-involvement in Queen Lucifella's death, but the heated and pointless argument of the queen's subordinates was interrupted by a man banging his fist menacingly on the table. The angry man ordered all the crying and confused ones to be silent with his fist and calmed his colleagues, saying that their queen would surely return soon. The resolute and stern man who spoke Thai words to the villains was the Sin of Wrath, having the name of Crom. He added to his words that they must protect the country of their queen Luciferia, Runabelt, until the last moment. Crom went on to convince his colleagues that they were obligated to fulfill their duties even until then, and they were obligated to protect the queen's body. And until she returns, according to Crom, unfortunately, they will not be able to trust each other. It was for this reason that Sin of Wrath said he hoped the queen's throne would not be empty for long, but since Queen Runabelt was gone, Crom asked everyone to stay if they were loyal to the queen, or leave if they no longer had the strength. Eventually, Runabelt was left by two who no longer wanted to serve the queen and be her subordinates. Those who stayed behind escorted the departing ones with a look. Looking at the two traitors who were no longer servants of the queen, Sin Envy, the green-haired girl said that she had heard that Nate, who had been the first to leave them, was missing. Crom was a little surprised by this. Crom, looking at the sin of envy and lust, confessed to them that he was surprised, for he did not think that the two of them would stay to serve the queen further. The sin of envy, whose name is Beatrice, said that when the queen returns, she will immediately see who was most loyal to her, and one day she too will have her own throne next to Queen Lucifella's. Jack, the seducer, also said that he had hoped that their queen would return soon, then asked Crom if he would be bored waiting for her alone. Crom did not answer Jack's question in any way, whereupon the sins of envy and lust said they would be with Crom until the end. Crom remained silent, but in his silence one could read confidence and gratitude for his friend's support. With such optimism and hope for a bright future for the dark side, Crom, along with Beatrice and Jack, looked at the two who were leaving the queen and walking off into the sunset. All this Jack was telling his queen Lucifella, who had been reborn into the body of a saint and was just sitting on a crib, listening attentively to her friend. Jack confessed to the main character that after a long time he managed to make friends with the saints, but past offenses he could not forget. But then Jack said that he learned about the appearance of the saint and went here to kill her. But the seducer Jack said that he found out that the saint is Queen Runabelt, so he asked the heroine only to return home. However, the arch-rival Lucifella was in no hurry to tell Jack that she missed her home. She thought about the fact that if she hid under the power of Jack's spirits, it would not be difficult for her to get out of this annoying room. At that moment, the protagonist recalled a memory from her dream, in which the teacher Bachman, taking little Lucifella by the hand, took her to the temple to teach her the most important thing, magic. That memory made the witch slow down. Unexpectedly to Jack himself, Queen Lucifella told him that they couldn't go back now. Jack Casanova asked the queen in amazement the reason for this decision. Surprised, Jack asked his queen another question, wondering if she made such a decision precisely because of the forbidden magic, which the protagonist could not get in her past life. But the saint only remained silent. The little girl boldly told her friend that rebirth in a new body is her chance to find the cherished treasure located in Esperia. The protagonist recalls that the treasure she told her friend Jack about is a powerful and forbidden magic that teacher Bachman created years ago. The seducer Jack, putting his hands on Rudy and trying to change her queen's mind about going with him, said that then they should return to Runabelt and the heroine could find the treasure if they teamed up again and started fighting Esperia. A worried Jack also reminded the arch-villain Lucifella that the throne of Runabelt was still empty even after such a long time as 50 years. Trying to change the saint's mind, whose body contained Luciferia's soul, Jack sadly and wistfully said that not only was the throne empty, but also their hearts. Jack, along with Crom and Beatrice, were already tired of waiting for the queen. Jack said that the empty royal seat hurt them deeply, and they missed the arch-rival. Taking the protagonist's small palm in his hands, Jack confessed that they had believed and waited for their queen, and finally, their pleas had been answered. Jack knelt before his little queen, still holding her palm in his hands, and said hopefully that the girl would think a little more, and perhaps change her mind about staying in the palace to search for the treasure. The protagonist thought about her decision because her longtime friends have really been waiting for her in Runabelt for a long time. But even after remembering her friends, Lucifella realized that she must think rationally now. Archvedma Lucifella decided to politely explain her position to Jack Casanova, telling him that their enemies they are fighting are not as simple as they seem at first glance. In addition, the saint confessed to Jack that she doesn't want to create senseless sacrifices, because the reason she wants to find forbidden magic is all about her. The powerful witch in the saint's body also said that she couldn't understand what was going on because everything had changed so drastically, especially when she was reborn in the body of a child. Lucifella told Jack that at the moment she didn't know the person who poisoned her in her past life, so she had to be extremely careful. And now that she had been reborn as a saint, she had the perfect and probably the best opportunity to find the cherished forbidden magic. Jack sadly, and at the same time with understanding, looked with his blue eyes at the main character, because he still wished that the queen would return to her country and to the empty throne. Sin of Lust said with understanding and sadness that most likely his queen would never change her mind. But at the same time, Jack was calm for the reason that in the body of a saint, his queen would be safe among enemies, or rather saints. While the seducer Jack took the surprised saint in his arms, the protagonist asked his friend if he really agreed with her. The Sin of Lust, affectionately and carefully holding the little girl in his arms, replied to his queen Runabelt that he would very much like to take the protagonist with him, but then he wouldn't need to experience her wrath on himself. Seducer Jack placed the saint with the soul of arch-rival Lucifella back in her crib, touching her cheek with his index finger and saying that he would not spread rumors about her in Runabelt, leaving her here for the first 5 years of the protagonist's new life. Taking one last look at the saintly little girl, Jack told the protagonist to be careful, for if the other saints guessed who she really was, they wouldn't just let her go. Jack added that if word of this got out, then Crom would be so angry that he would blow the entire empire away. It was already a clear morning over Asperia after the important meeting between the protagonist and Jack, the clouds slowly drifting across the blue sky. Lifting the little saint in her arms, the gray-haired old woman realized and told the maid something that their saint didn't seem to be in the mood today, judging from her irritability and variable moods. One maid with brown hair suggested that perhaps the heroine had not slept well last night. The little heroine couldn't speak, but if she had the chance, she would have gladly told the women what she hadn't slept well because of her nighttime encounter with Jack. Archived Mother Lucifella realized that more time had passed since her last death than expected. She would age over time like all saints, but Jack, who had already lived over 50 years, would not. The heroine is surprised that he recognized her immediately, even though she was spawned into another body. Lucifella assumes that if for this more time Jack Casanova has not changed in any way, it means that her other friends have not experienced great changes. And the first person the saint thinks this about is Crom. The protagonist, sitting in the old woman's arms, thinks warily about what might happen if Crom finds out, or guesses that the saint is their dead queen and not an enemy. The archivist in the saint's body imagines how Asperia comes to an end due to the immense anger of Crom, who exclaims in a menacing voice that if the saints don't give him one of us now, he will immediately start a bloody war. The saint is horrified by this, for this is one possible scenario of what will happen if even someone guesses that she is actually Lucifella. The little girl, still in the arms of the white-haired woman, is more than sure that the city will turn into ashes, and it is only because of Chroma, who is very dear to the queen. The protagonist realizes that for her to die before the battle begins is one of the most humiliating things that could happen to her. She has no idea what Crom and her other underlings experienced at the moment of her death. For this reason, the saint is saddened, for she is sure that Crom is angry at her for leaving them at such an important moment for Runabelt. In the meantime, the jolly and cheerful seducer Jack had already arrived in Runabelt, and with a graceful raise of his left hand he announced to everyone that he had returned. Beatrice, without touching anyone, quietly wrote on pieces of paper with a black quill, but when Jack, who had been assigned such an important and complicated task as the murder of a saint, showed up, the green-haired girl dropped the quill in shock, asking Jack what he had been doing all this time. While Beatrice sat at the table with a face like she was about to kill the annoying Jack herself, the Sin of Lust answered her affectionately and cheerfully that there was nothing special about his meeting, as he had just met someone he loved. Dreamy Jack added to his words that she was still just a little girl, and he was very interested in how beautiful she would be when she finally grew up. A stunned and exasperated Beatrice asked Jack if he was now talking about the saint herself. While Beatrice was yelling at Jack about how he couldn't be trusted with anything at all, Jack turned his attention to the empty table where his buddy Crom usually sat. He wondered where he might have gone. While Beatrice was furiously venting her frustration on Jack, the seducer asked her where Crom was. Beatrice replied that he had recently left with a bouquet of flowers. Jack listened to her intently, while Beatrice also suggested that he had probably gone to see the queen with the flowers. It turned out to be just as Beatrice had said. Crom was laying 2 beautiful white flowers in a vase, symbolizing repose and mourning for the deceased person. Carefully placing the 2 white flowers in a small vase on the floor, Crom sadly and without emotion memorialized his deceased queen, to whom he was actually very attached. Kneeling in front of the queen and keeping his eyes on her, Crom asked her longingly when she would return to them, not expecting to hear an answer. In a beautiful coffin with a glass lid rested the body of Lucifella, the arch-rival who had spent her entire life bringing creepiness and fear to all of humanity and the continent. Her long red hair lay in numerous marvelous colors, but no matter how much Crom wished it, the green eyes of the arch-rival did not open even after 50 years. During this time, the protagonist has vivid and clear memories from her past life. In them, she is on the battlefield, where the battle has already ended in victory on the part of Luciferia. The saints have been defeated and lie exhausted on the ground, welcoming the sunset. The large and formidable shadow of the witch Luciferia fell upon the losing battle against evil relative George IV, who stared in shock at the all-powerful witch before him. The witch questioned her ward if this was the one who had been sent by the Holy Father to kill her and all evildoers. While the archwitch kept her eyes on the red-haired knight, Crom answered her queen that George II, the strongest paladin in all of Hesperia, was now kneeling before her. The two evil mages stood before an exhausted and frightened George II, who did not even risk moving or speaking to his enemies. But then he muttered something he couldn't believe his eyes right now. George II, realizing who now stood before him, exclaimed that the red-haired girl in front of him was the invincible arch-rival Lucifella herself. Feeling incredibly afraid of the powerful forces of evil for his life, George II naively and fearfully exclaimed that he loved Lucifella incredibly and also asked her to make him her slave. Lucifella had expected to hear anything from her enemy, but clearly not such harsh and feigned words of love and devotion. Because of this, she was in amazement and Crom with her, feeling perhaps some shame for George II. Lucifella, together with Crom, did not even know what to say to such a grateful man as George, who was first sent to destroy the villains, but now he confesses his love to the witch and wants to go to their side. Because of this, an awkward silence ensues. But unlike the surprised arch-rival Lucifella, who looked at Georg with her mouth ajar, Crom quickly disliked it, and his mood changed from shock to anger. Crom, still in anger at George II, who thinks he can easily change enemies and allies, pulled out a dagger from under his body, telling his queen that George was asking for his own death. A surprised Lucifella turned to Crom, trying to calm him down. At this point, the protagonist wakes up and sneezes, still lying in her small crib and covered by a small blanket. The saint, in which the soul of Lucifella is located, with a shudder recalled the dream, realizing that such memories from her past life make her body covered with goosebumps. But even this time, the girl was not given the opportunity to wake up quietly, because someone was already rushing to her, who noticed that the saint was about to open her eyes. The person who was rushing to the newly awakened protagonist turned out to be George III, who shockingly asked the saint if she had frozen. Georg had most likely decided that the girl was frozen by the goosebumps that had run down her body earlier. While the holy girl squealed and pushed the loud and annoying Georg away, Georg himself comforted the heroine, saying he would quickly bring her a warm blanket now. Georg noticed that his saint and near saint was not happy that he had lifted her up in his arms, worrying about her condition, so a slightly saddened paladin asked why the protagonist disliked him being so close. George IV, who had been watching everything, answered his father that the reason might be that he had approached her too abruptly, frightening the little girl. But the little saint, who could not yet speak, said in her head that she had not expected to meet here her enemy, the descendant of the sin of idleness, who was George. The fact is that Georg is the second responsible for the sin of idleness. That is inactivity. He is the paladin from the temple who betrayed the saints and joined Lucifella. And now the protagonist sees before her two descendants of George II, the paladin George III, and the little George IV, who is the personal knight of the saint. The heroine is surprised to find that George II has a nephew who looks exactly like him, and she is hell that the child of the fourth generation escaped this fate. The protagonist realizes that George III is not just similar to George III, but they are like two drops of water, with a red beard, hair, and the same annoying character. But then the holy girl heard a familiar and pleasant female voice that asked if the protagonist had waited too long for her. The protagonist recognized the voice and hurriedly rushed to see the familiar person. The kind voice belonged to an old woman with gray, long hair who was holding a warm blanket for the holy girl. As soon as the protagonist saw the old woman, she wanted to quickly plunge into her arms, calling her Mary in her mind, but in reality, because the heroine could not speak clearly, she just joyfully hooted and hollered. The protagonist happily plunged into the old woman's embrace, realizing that she had been incredibly looking forward to her warm embrace and gentle voice. If Lucifella could speak, she would confess to Marie that in this cruel world, where she can do nothing, she gives her a chance to breathe. But suddenly another servant approached Maria and the saint and asked Maria if she had the holy girl. Mary in response inquired of the servant what was wrong. The obedient servant replied that Mr. Bachman had requested an audience with the saint and was waiting for her in his room. Deciding not to delay, Mrs. Maria, with the saint in her arms and accompanied by the little knight George IV, already went to Bachman, talking about the fact that Mr. Bachman would soon become a Holy Father. Holy Father is the highest ecclesiastical rank among priests, and Bachman has the honor of becoming one for the reason that he was the first to find the saint in the garden fountain. After walking down the hallway, Mary arrived at Bachman's door with the saint in her arms, and George IV also stood beside her. They both bowed to the soon-to-be Holy Father, who would soon no longer bow his head to anyone. Mr. Bachman also bowed his head to the protagonist, saying that he was very happy to see the saint. Bachman bowed to the holy girl because even if he were to be a holy father, the first place in the pyramid of the realm would still be occupied by the precious saint. While in a high-ceilinged, whitewashed room decorated with unique patterns, Bachman asked Mary and George to leave him alone with the saint. Old Mary wanted to object to the future Holy Father, trying to warn that the saint should never be left unguarded, but Bachman calmed the woman down, saying that he just wanted to say something to the protagonist, and it wouldn't take long. Lucifella, who is in the body of a saint, is wary of Bachman's words because why would he suddenly need to talk to a child who can't speak or understand words? The protagonist wonders what is the matter. After Mary, together with George, left the room and closed the door, Bachman walked around the room with the saint in his arms, while Lucifella wondered if he had guessed who she really was. The future Saint Father looked up and began to tell the protagonist that the first Saint Father who built this temple left only one image of the goddess, which is painted on the ceiling. On the ceiling was indeed a beautiful and large image of a fair-haired girl in light-colored robes, whom Bachman and all the others refer to as the goddess. In the image, she shines her divine light on everyone, and below her, people are stretching out their arms. Bachman proceeded to tell the main character that the image she is looking at is the last prophecy the goddess left them. Lucifella, in the body of the holy girl, thought she had heard it all at first, but then she realized it all and was shocked at the words of the future Saint Father Bachman. Mr. Bachman said the last words to the saint, which caused the protagonist a real stunned. Looking at the little girl, the priest admitted that no one else could not get a similar prophecy than the image of the holy goddess. Lucifella experienced incredible surprise, realizing that there was actually only one prophecy from the Holy Father, and not several as she had thought. It turns out that all the prophecies passed down by the past Holy Father were just plain lies and fiction, created more to keep people calm and under control, especially when there was a war going on. But the protagonist's exuberant thoughts were interrupted again by Bachman, who said that the goddess had not left them, leaving only one prophecy. A second revelation of the goddess was sent to the saints. The protagonist remained curiously silent as she listened to the Lord, who went on to say that the second revelation of the goddess was the birth of the saint, that is, Lucifella. Bachman, looking respectfully at the statue of the first father, who died just before the main character's rebirth, told Lucifella that he was the one who predicted the birth of the saint. Mr. Bachman and the baby in his arms were looking at the large and tall statue of the first father. The statue had a cross on its chest, and he himself was dressed in rich robes with a headdress. Lucifella, while in the body of a saint, looked at the tall statue of the first saint with anger and disdain, remembering that she had some not-so-fond memories of him, which is an amusing irony. Archbishop Bachman went on to say that various truths had been passed down to the fathers from generation to generation through the likes of the chronicles that now lay on the Lord's desk. And this time, according to Bachman, that role fell to him. Going through the precious oracles on the table, Mr. Bachman said that the last oracle left by the goddess 500 years ago was a prophecy about the end of the world. Mr. Bachman showed the protagonist an oracle depicting the battle between the Holy Father and the Archmage, then said that obtaining forbidden magic and bringing about the end of the world was the goal of the dead Archmage Lucifella. The old man went on to tell the saint that even after the death of Archmage Lucifella, her remaining followers would not give up trying to do evil on the continent and push it towards the end of the world. The archbishop continued to look at the papers on his desk before confessing to the protagonist that her arrival was, without exaggeration, their last hope that the goddess had not yet abandoned them. The protagonist, who is actually an evil, omnipotent, and all-powerful witch who wants to bring about the end of the world, only looked at all the oracles with a satisfied look, thinking that the goddess had not heard them after all, which is what the whole of Hesperia is hoping for. While Archbishop Bachman was once again trying to convince the holy little girl that she was the last hope for all of humanity, Lucifella, in the body of a saint, was thinking that what the saints believe and hope for is actually a calamity that will soon destroy the world, and Lucifella is referring to herself. The protagonist is already imagining herself lying pretty on the royal throne, rejoicing in her cunning plan that the saints now believe, saying she is a messenger from heaven who will save them. But according to Lucifella, the saints don't even know if their goddess even exists. Turning to the goddess who, for some unknown reason, decided to rebirth Lucifella into a saint, the heroine tells her that this was her biggest mistake in her entire existence. Suddenly, a little girl, staying in Bachman's arms, tried to speak, inarticulately asking the archbishop to show her forbidden magic, but the little girl did not hear a quick answer because Bachman's mood has changed greatly. The protagonist was alarmed and even frightened by the fact that the little girl's first words about forbidden magic made Bachman suddenly change his mood for the worse, which before had been normal and slightly elevated. Seeing the bearded archbishop's face, Lucifella recalls the words of Jack, who warned her beforehand not to let anyone guess who she really was. In that important meeting, Jack told the saint that if the priest guessed who she was, they definitely wouldn't let her go. Lucifella begins to feel fear for her 101st life. The little holy girl continued to look at Archbishop Bachman with anxiety and fear, not understanding what he had in mind and what he was going to do. The protagonist realizes that no one can help her in case of danger, so she worries even more. And the future Holy Father Bachman did not take his blue, worried eyes off the holy girl. In addition, he trembled with excitement for a still unknown reason. Lucifella in the holy little girl's body didn't understand Bachman's reaction and continued to stare at him, anticipating all the most horrible things that could happen to her. She wondered if he had figured out who she really was after all, or if Bachman didn't have such sharp wits for his years. While the protagonist fears for Bachman recognizing her as the dead Lucifella, the old man himself hurried out of the room with the saint in his arms. Bachman hurried out of the room, in his haste calling Maria to him, who was fortunately nearby. The protagonist, and up to this point, did not understand the events taking place, until the archbishop did not tell Mary something. But it turns out that all of Bachman's excitement stemmed from the fact that the saint only needed a diaper change, which he informed Maria about. The protagonist was in for a surprise, realizing that it was a lot simpler than she had been giving herself credit for. While Maria held the baby in her arms, sharing her opinion about her being a little pale, the future Holy Father was in a hurry to find a suitable place nearby to put the saint there and conveniently change her diaper. The protagonist is still stunned at how people can be so savvy. The saint, in whose body Lucifella's soul lurked, started screaming angrily and exhaustedly, trying to tell even Bachman and Mary to leave her alone. But the future Saint Father, who already had an idea born in his head, ran to carry it out, dropping his cap from his head. The little girl continued to scream exhaustedly, begging Maria to leave her alone. But at this time, the archbishop, who was executing his plan, placed his palms on one of the columns of the building, then took a breath, preparing about to use his magic. Suddenly, Bachman's hands began to emit a magical, holy, bright light, and large veins protruded on his forearms. Using his power, Bachman began to break the stone column until it cracked with his bare hands. Bachman only had to use a drop more effort to lift the stone column and lift it above him, holding it in his arms. The impressed Mary watched old man Bachman's efforts with joy, telling the saint to watch him labor for her comfort and benefit in creating the stone crib, but the heroine, amazed by such events, wanted to say that she just wanted to see forbidden magic, not this. Archbishop Bachman kindly placed the torn column from the foundation on the floor, creating the perfect surface to change the holy baby girl's diaper. Mary hurriedly placed the heroine on the column, saying that she would do the whole thing now. The protagonist looked at Maria with resentment and anger at everyone, muttering in her mind that she, the arch-rival Lucifella, could not be intimidated by anyone with some muscles. In addition, Lucifella, being chained in the body of a saint, promised herself that a little later, or rather, when she grows up to the age when she can speak clearly, she will once again be sure to ask Bachman about forbidden magic. After this promise, the protagonist lived in the body of a holy girl sent by the goddess for 5 years. During this time, she changed and grew a lot, learning to walk, eat, and speak clearly, which was very important for her. One beautiful, clear, warm day, a servant, together with the Holy Father Bachman, was carrying heavy sacks from one place to another. The good servant thanked Bachman for his help, marveling that such a high-ranking man like him was carrying such heavy things on his own. The Holy Father said he was not worth thanking. St. Father Bachman decided to remove the cap from his head, revealing his new, beautiful, and long snow-white hair that he did not have before. The Holy Father, with a smile, once again told the servant that he would always help him. While the servant and the Holy Father were talking politely, the other servants were watching them, gossiping about whether Bachman always had such thick hair. But another co-worker answered him that his hair had gotten that way right after that man's blessing. The employee asked his friend if she was referring to the holy water, to which the woman replied hesitantly at first, not knowing how to tell the truth. But then she informed him that the one who had blessed the Holy Father by giving him such beautiful hair was now coming to them. To the Holy Father and the other servants hurried the saint, or rather Lucifella, who was already 5 years old. She was no longer a defenseless infant who needed her diaper changed. She already knew how to do many things and also possessed the human speech that she had longed for as a little girl. The saint hurried over to Bachman, calling him by name. The Holy Father immediately noticed the pretty little girl in her dress paying attention to her, which the others did as well. The saint really wanted to say or do something to him, so she rather ran to him. The saint, who seemed to be the sweetest and most beautiful of all the girls that existed on the continent, ran to her favorite teacher, who sat down in front of her on his knees and held out his arms for a hug. But no matter how cute and charming the main character seemed, in her heart she remained the same evil and powerful witch Lucifella, who was feared by everyone. She went to the Holy Father with an evil look, clearly not to hug or kiss. After using almost all of her power on the Holy Father, the protagonist kicked him in the stomach with her little foot, telling him that he should. And the Holy Father didn't even hold a grudge against the saint. He kept smiling, even though she had hit him. The Holy Father, putting his hand on his heart, kindly confessed to the saint that he was very glad that she had rewarded him with her visit and presence before him. But the embittered girl objected to the teacher that she would not have come then at all if she had known that Bachman would be so pleased, and the angry protagonist for the reason that the Holy Father should have come to her, not she to him. But quite suddenly, the Holy Father and the saint heard a young boy's voice calling for Lucifella, wondering where she had gone. The saint immediately reacted, realizing that it was George IV who was looking for her, so she made the decision to run further to hide from him. The girl ran in a flash in the opposite direction, trying to hide from her bodyguard and saying a brief goodbye to the Holy Father and the servants. One servant swept up and told Bachman that the saint was very energetic today. The protagonist was running away from Georg, reflecting on the fact that it had been several years since she had been reborn as a saint. She was now 5 years old and had learned a lot. And once she learned to speak, there wasn't a day that went by that she didn't ask St. Father Bachman to tell her about forbidden magic. She begged him every day to tell her about it, but every time she got the same answer. Bachman only tells her that he will tell the girl about the forbidden magic only when she is a little older. The girl kept running away from Georg, realizing that the Holy Father doesn't seem to be going to tell her anything about forbidden magic until she is of age. But the little protagonist was not going to give up. She decided that if her teacher didn't tell her about forbidden magic, she would learn all about it on her own. The saint continued to hide from everyone in the palace, even when the servants were looking for her. And this time, too, the girl was searched for by Mary, wandering around the palace and asking the saint where she was. The girl maintained a sepulchral silence, being right behind the back of an agitated Mary, who tried to call the saint to her, saying it was soon lunchtime. But the heroine had no plans to reveal herself. But the holy girl Lucifella still had other plans than lunch on the schedule. She slyly and cunningly reflected that she was no longer of the age to cry in Mary's arms, much less obey her. However, in addition to complete independence and will from adults, the girl had with her another strong trump card in the form of divine power. Her small palms suddenly began to radiate radiance. The girl, looking at her magical hands emitting divine radiance, realized that she could now effortlessly mess with the powers of the gods. The saint, of course, disliked the fact that her first attempt to manifest her divine power ended up curing the Holy Father of a bald spot on his head by giving him beautiful hair. But the optimistic girl told herself that this time she would definitely get to the truth and use her divine power in more important matters. The devious plans of the villainess in the saint's body were interrupted by a nearby voice that alerted Lucifella that it had found her. The heroine quickly turned her attention to this person. A tall, unbeknownst to her, tall man appeared before the villainess, who was dressed in servant's clothes and had a hood over his head that made it impossible to see his face. The unknown person came closer to the girl until the saint did not understand who it was and what he wanted. As soon as the stranger came closer and started pulling something out from under his light-colored clothes, Lucifella immediately felt his strange energy, which was not good. From underneath his holy robe, the servant pulled out a sharp and shiny long dagger, and holding it in his hand, the stranger said for the protagonist to finally die, for the glory of Runabelt. Pointing the point of the knife at the girl, the stranger, uttering his crowning phrase, was about to swing at the little holy child and kill her in honor of his country. But he had no idea that the little girl was not even feeling fear and was also ready to fight back against the killer. The little girl, without much worry, kicked her killer in the stomach, not even leaving the stranger a second chance. It seems that this happens to the main character often if she acts so calmly and decisively. Giving the stranger an irreparable kick to the stomach that the killer would definitely not get up from, the girl began to taunt him with a smirk, asking him what he dared to say to her. The astonished stranger answered nothing strongly to the girl. He didn't understand how such a fragile and small creature like Saint was capable of punching her in the stomach with such great force. The stranger, who had been hired to be the saint's killer, recalls the last time he was given advice, showing information and images of the saint on papers. The person ordering the murder turned out to be Crom, who advised the stranger to never lose his grip and not to treat her as nothing just because she is a child, because no one has been able to kill her yet. Remembering Crom's words, the stranger realized his major mistake. He had treated the girl as a mere child that he needed to eliminate. But then the killer wondered why she wasn't an ordinary girl. Lucifella's killer fell to the ground, not even intending to get up. He barely opened his eyes, and then he heard the brave saint asking him to open his eyes better, calling him Grandpa. Opening his eyes at the strong girl's request, the stunned assassin saw the saint in front of him, who dared to put her foot on the stranger's chest, thus showing who was really stronger here. While the astonished killer could not believe that he was defeated by a little girl in a dress, the protagonist said that if he was about to die, then let him fulfill some of her wishes before he died. The stranger guessed that the protagonist wanted to interrogate him, finding out all the precious information about who he was and where he came from, so finding his strength, he wasn't going to lose so easily. Rising from the ground, the stranger began to search in a hurry for one thing that was in his pocket. While he was looking for suicide poison so he wouldn't give away valuable information to the girl, the protagonist stood and watched what he was doing. Another surprise to the killer was that he still couldn't find the suicide poison in his pockets, but it was kindly held out by the saint, asking if that's what he was looking for now. The stranger was in shock, realizing that even here he had failed. Showing the stranger her sly and devious smile, the girl used her magic to make the poison capsule crack open and disappear. The saint said that he should not care what danger he faced. The saint added an explanation to her words that he shouldn't just drop everything like that and die after all. He was the kind of person someone relied on. With those words, the poison capsule completely dissolved from the girl's divine magic. On the frightened stranger fell the ominous shadow of the saint, who in fact was the witch Lucifella. Looking at her victim, the protagonist ordered him to answer all her questions. After a short time, in front of the holy girl already lay an exhausted stranger who could not even get up from the ground. The saint was not sad. She just thought about the fact that this guy is now just another blank. The protagonist recalled Jack's words, who said that in time, many suicides like the stranger would come to her. The girl held the dagger that the killer wanted to kill her with and contemplated its blade. Looking into the mirror blade of the dagger and seeing her real face in it, the saint with the soul of Lucifella realizes that if her killers are coming to her one at a time, it means they haven't figured out who she really is yet. As the girl hides the evidence of the crime, that is the dagger, in a vase with a plant, she realizes that, in fact, suicides do not cause her much trouble. It is enough for the girl to deal with the murderer by first hiding the evidence. After getting rid of the evidence, the girl would use magic to erase the memories of all her killers. It saddened her that she was not getting any information from them and still had to clean up after them. The girl didn't really want to get rid of the strangers and bully them because she just wanted to find out from them how her longtime boyfriends, Chrome, Jack, and others were doing. The girl stood by the lying murderer as if waiting for someone, as if nothing had happened. She thought that she should not worry about her friends because, like all magic, they cannot die of old age. At that time, George IV came running to her, looking for the heroine all over the palace. The little girl was rushed to the scene by George IV, who, trying to catch his breath, alerted the protagonist that he and Mary had been looking for her for a long time. The protagonist doesn't like the fact that she's been caught out this time, too, noticing that she's once again standing next to a minister who has supposedly fallen unconscious. The saint innocently pointed a finger at the guy lying there, telling Georg that the man had suddenly passed out in front of her. As dark night was already falling in Asperia, the holy girl kept thinking about what would have happened to him if the stranger who wanted to kill her had not been found unconscious. Maria tucked the girl into bed, talking to her before going to sleep. She praised the saint for finding the body of the servant in the garden for the umpteenth time today. The saint said naively that she didn't see anything wrong with it, for she had simply done what she had to do. The girl was calm for her deeds because she realizes that the clerics in the palace are not very observant to details, constantly covering themselves with their faith and religion. Lucifella, in the body of a saint, realizes that because of one child named Georg who always follows her, she can't properly retrieve forbidden magic. And if the ministers find out about the murderers, the guards will become even more, which the girl does not want. While the girl was flying in her thoughts regarding forbidden magic, Maria smilingly stroked the saint's head and wished her sweet dreams, getting ready to leave. Feeling the old woman's warm hand on her head, the protagonist realized that although she was trying to take revenge on everyone and become the strongest, she even liked such a carefree atmosphere. Old Maria closed the door, admiring the way the tired, saintly girl yawned, preparing to sink into a long-awaited sleep on a large and soft bed. But after Maria closed the door, the smile was gone from her face, as was her good mood. She became serious for some as yet unknown reason. Clearly plotting something, the old woman stood near the door to the bedroom, silently thinking about something without saying a word. After that, she was going somewhere else. Old Mary decided to walk away from the saint's room, heading for another important place she must go to. In the middle of the dark night, when absolutely everyone was asleep, dreaming their fifth dream, there was still a bright light burning in one of the beautiful rooms of the palace, illuminating the windows, shelves of books, and patterns on the walls. It turns out that in this same room with books, there was a triangular table where Holy Father Bachman and other important people of the palace were sitting. They seemed to be waiting for Mary's arrival. Noticing that an unknown person was opening the door to the room with the important and secret meeting, all the saints turned toward the entrance, worried lest they be discovered by any other person who should not even know about the meeting. But to the delight of all present, the person who was about to join their meeting turned out to be an old woman named Mary, who had put the saint to bed before. She bowed to her colleagues and apologized, saying that she was a little late. Good St. Father Bachman told Maria that she should not apologize for that, as they themselves had just gathered. The Holy Father also told old Marie to hurry up and sit down at the table while Mary herself was clearly thinking about something, which was not causing her any positive emotions. She was serious. As everyone sat down at the triangular table and prepared to talk about something important, St. Father Bachman mumbled that he was now declaring the meeting open, which was dedicated to the little saint. After declaring the meeting open, the Holy Father began the story of the problem by saying that it is common lately to find priests unconscious. But beyond that, the priests were not just unconscious, but were also losing their memory. In addition, according to the Holy Father, dangerous weapons had been found nearby today. Bachman continued speaking, mentioning that the common factor of these strange, horrifying, and mysterious events is one detail that unites all these cases. When speaking of the mystical detail, the Holy Father is referring to the fact that always these incidents occur in the vicinity of a saint who is simply standing next to the ministers who are lying down. The priest paused in his story for his colleagues to conceive of the information and the situation, which is happening more and more frequently. Afterward, Bachman drew a conclusion of sorts. Thus, the priest is going to make an important conclusion about the dangerous situation in the palace, making his voice even more serious and his face not smiling. The atmosphere in the room began to heat up rapidly. But suddenly, the priest, who had been serious all this time, joyfully proclaimed that they only needed to increase the guards for the holy girl. Some of the officers agreed with this simple solution, also smiling. However, one of the protesters, who has a bald head, mustache, monocle, and bushy eyebrows, pounded his fist on the table and shouted that he was protesting against the Holy Father, as were some of the other employees. The protesting, mustachioed priest tried to argue his point by asking if they could all pay for new security for the saint. St. Father Bachman told everyone present that Priest Omar had just voiced his opinion, then turned to Sister Maria, who was sitting next to him, asking her what she thought about the matter. Sister Maria also told the Holy Father that for the moment they could use to improve the saint's security as soon as possible. You can see by old Lady Maria that she is worried about the protagonist more than anyone else. While Omar, who voted against increasing the saint's guards, was watching Marie disappointedly, the old woman continued to say that right now the holy girl is only guarded by Georg, and it's not an easy job at all. The sister added that they should not save money on the saint. But then the priest Omar decided to confess loudly to everyone that they didn't just have little money to strengthen the saint's guard. They had none at all, and Omar was worried about that. The worried Omar told his colleagues that he was not against strengthening the guards, but he was worried that they could not strengthen them for the simple reason that they had no money at all. The other servants, meanwhile, were talking among themselves, saying that they had heard rumors that the church was low on money and that donations were down, but that it was not that serious. The red-haired servant even laughed and shared his surprise, saying that he had never thought they would have no money even for guards. Meanwhile, Omar was anxiously grabbing his head, not knowing what to say to the others. From fear, Priest Omar was ready to lose the last hair on his head because he is the one who is responsible for the finances of the church, which, it turns out, are no longer available even for the protection of such an important person as a saint. The fact is that Asperia's priests are not particularly financially literate when they have a lot of money. They spend it all the time, so the money appears and then disappears again, and this time they're practically gone, which the anxious Omar has been responsible for all along. While Omar was loudly warning everyone for the last time not to even think about security until they had enough money, Sister Maria was sitting at the table with a smirk, apparently having thought of something. Putting her hand up, Sister Mary said that if lack of money was an incredibly big problem for them, she had an idea on how to get guards for the saint without them. Meanwhile, in Runebelt, Crom, who has an incredible longing for his deceased queen Lucifella, sees a memory from his life involving her. The witch Lucifella calls Crom to her, calling him her baby. Turning to her most loyal servant Crom, Lucifella tells him that even if she dies, she will always remember her past life. Crom listens intently to the queen, for this is what she wants to tell only him and no one else. Taking Crom's hand, the witch Lucifella went on to say that even after death, when she reappears in the world, she will definitely return to Runebelt, no matter what it costs her. And it was for this reason that Archwitch Lucifella, while on the balcony with Crumb, wanted to place a very important small thing in his hand. Putting a bottle with a red potion on Crumb's palm, Lucifella said that if Crumb uses it and drinks it, they will be able to meet even after several decades. But if suddenly, according to the Queen, she will never be able to be reborn after receiving forbidden magic, she, with joy and hope in her eyes, asks Crumb to protect Runabelt instead of her. Crumb's warm and precious memories are suddenly cut short because he is interrupted by a foreign voice calling his name. Crumb, sitting at his desk, apologized to his subject, saying that he was thinking a bit so he didn't hear him, then asked to continue the conversation. And the servant dressed in dark clothes continued to read out to Mr. Crumb the information that the Holy Temple had decided to open a selection tournament to increase the Holy Girl's security. The subordinate continued to read out information to the serious Crumb about the tournaments, the saint, and the temple, while Crumb had not only the text, but also pictures of images of the saint along with Georg. Crumb sat there and did not understand the logic of the saints, that, instead of paying for labor, they also take money for the efforts of the participants. He also learned that the selected ones participate for free, and the others have to pay to participate. The subordinate went on to tell Crumb that it was likely that the saints organized the selection tournaments because of the frequent attacks on the saint, or rather the appearance of assassins. But Crumb asked the subordinate what was known about the last suicide bomber sent to kill the protagonist. The servant replied to Crumb that the assassin who was supposed to kill the saint had completely lost his memory, so he began to serve the priests. This caused Sin of Wrath to silently ponder, because the assassin definitely couldn't have been killed so skillfully by the dim-witted priests. Reflecting on the strange situation, Crumb told his ward that it could only be the work of the saint herself, who commands over the minds of all people, forcing anyone undesirable to forget about the past and start serving the light. Suddenly, a cheerful, even happy Jack Casanova appeared right next to Crumb's work-focused Jack, who interjected to ask if the characters were talking about the saint. While Crumb wondered to Jack if he had overheard the conversation using the power of spirits again, the frightened servant of darkness stood with a surprised face, a little afraid of Jack. The seductive Jack didn't answer Crumb's question, saying that if the two of them were talking about the new qualifiers in Asperia, he could go there without much trouble and perform any task so well that Crumb would be saying thank you to him afterward. But one thing was clear from the look on Crumb's face. He clearly didn't support the idea of cheerful Jack going to cross him. Tapping the table with the palm of his hand and standing up from his chair, Crumb menacingly and firmly told Jack no, which made the Sin of Lust a little confused. Realizing that he was now the only one who could effect anything, and not going to rely on anyone else's help anymore, Crumb looked at Jack with his serious and angry gaze, informing him that he would be going there himself. Jack's seducer wondered what his friend had gotten his mind on so suddenly. He looked at Crumb with some consternation and not a little confusion, asking him a clarifying question, hoping he had heard him. Jack told the evil Crumb that he could easily hide his mana, that is, his magic aura, with the power of the spirits, but that Crumb, who had it written on his forehead that he was a villain and a wizard, would be quickly discovered. To this, Crumb said that although he can hide his mana, Jack is already known to everyone as the messenger from Rubelt, so as soon as he appears in Asperia, the saints will immediately realize everything. Jack again wanted to hesitantly object, asking who would then be in charge of Runabelt. Crumb began to remove a ring clearly related to the rule of Runabelt. Most likely he already knew an idea that would allow him to leave his country without harming it. Releasing the precious ring from his magical blue palm, Crumb told Jack that he had one way to accomplish his trek to Asperia. The incredibly valuable ring had cleverly fallen into the hands of a cunning sorceress who had enveloped it in her poison-green magic. The green-haired girl, smiling slyly at being entrusted with such a valuable item, confessed that she was eager to know what Crumb had called her for before. The villainess added that she never would have thought he would trust her with his business. Clutching Crumb's ring in her hand, the Sin of Envy named Beatrice promised that she would show Crumb how outstanding a leader of Runabelt she was. Jack stood in the room staring in defeat at Beatrice, whom Crumb had entrusted with the governance of the country. The green-haired witch, waving her hands, asked Crom not to come as long as possible, for as long as she was here, he had nothing to worry about. Crom answered his friend that in that case he would believe her and trust her to do her job, which surprised Jack, who also claimed to be a witch. Jack, who had been unhappy with Crom's decision up to that point, cried out for him to wait and listen to the end. But Crom immediately awakened his magic, about to cast it on the annoying Jack. At the same second Jack was voicing his objections, a blob of magic flew into the wall right next to his head, which Crom wanted to release specifically at Jack's face, but missed slightly. Jack's seducer was both startled and silenced by this. While Jack looked at Crom in shock and fear, Crom told him that he would go to Hesperia himself. For the idiotic reason he had saved the saint, she had been alive for 5 years. The decaying temple had risen again. Crom adds that the temple's affairs have now gotten so good that suspicions of Jack's treachery are no longer strange. This is one of the reasons why Crom wants to go there himself. From this, Crom concluded by saying that on top of all this, Jack was obsessed with Lucifella, but now, for some unknown reason, has abruptly switched to the saint. Piercing Jack with his angry gaze, Crom angrily uttered the fateful words to everyone. Mole, he was beginning to be convinced that the saint was the reincarnation of Lucifella that Jack had been holding back. Jack's face changed instantly, but he didn't want to let on that he knew the truth. Instead, he continued to remain silent and listen to Crom's plan. At the end, Crom said that if Lucifella's reincarnation into a saint is true, he wants to see for himself by seeing and hearing everything with his own eyes and ears. Crom wants to see if the saint is worthy of mercy. While Crom was about to move to the holy girl, already guessing that it is Lucifella, the protagonist was in the holy temple eating cookies, but at that moment Sister Mary came to her to make an announcement. The heroine was incredibly surprised, not understanding what the sister was talking about. Sister Maria explained to the girl that they are planning to increase the security for her, and therefore soon it is necessary to officially announce her existence. While Maria was trying to tell the shocked girl that the strongest and most worthy men from all over the continent would be gathered for her sake, the protagonist, being angry, tried to tell her sister that one guard was enough for her, pointing to George IV. After bowing to the saint, George IV replied that his mistress told him that she didn't need an annoying guard like him. Georg added that it looked like it was time to leave her for good. The evil holy girl with Lucifella's soul tried to explain to Georg that she meant that she didn't want him following her around all the time, but she wasn't saying that she had to change her guard to a cooler one. Sister Mary calmed the girl down by saying that it's all about making sure Saint grows up in peace and without problems. So Mary asked the heroine to understand that and accept it. Maria kept wiping cookie crumbs off the saint's cheeks with a towel while the girl, though angrily, still accepts that she will have a bunch of guards and bodyguards. Lucifella realizes that she has never been able to find the forbidden magic. Even being in the body of a saint for 5 years, she has no idea how long it will take her to find it, if she will be followed by a crowd of bodyguards from which you can't hide. The protagonist realizes that there is no other way but to stop the tournament proper by making sure she doesn't have an increased guard. Suddenly, Georg noticed the saint come down from her chair, striding towards him. The boy turned his attention to her, and Lucifella turned to him, calling Georg, "Little girl." The little girl approached Georg and, taking him by his cloak, asked him affectionately not to leave, as if apologizing for her earlier rudeness. The protagonist, slightly covered with a blush, explained her behavior by saying that she was thus playing a trick on him, for she actually liked him. While the small and surprised George IV looked into the girl's eyes and also blushed at the girl's sincere, sweet, and kind words, the protagonist decided to confess that she needed him. George IV hid his embarrassment with his hands, trying to thank the saint for such words, and Sister Mary, who was still watching everything, literally lit up with happiness and the fact that the children became closer to each other. The saint's personal knight, who couldn't even suspect that the girl would ever say such words to him, knelt in front of the protagonist and wiped the tears from his eyes with his hand, while Lucifella was still holding him by his cloak and was about to say one more important thing. What was little Georg's surprise when, instead of another nice words and compliments he heard from the girl, that he would definitely also take part in a tournament where the strongest of the strong would fight. Georg looked at the young saint in shock and asked her about it, realizing what a clever and cunning trap he had fallen into. But the protagonist only looked at Georg contentedly, showing him her sly smile and evil gaze, as if to show him who the real prankster was. On the next, equally clear and beautiful day, many people had already gathered near the Holy Palace to participate in the tournament that was about to begin. While the country's flags were flying in the wind against the blue sky, George III sincerely congratulated those who had passed the qualifying tests and who were truly ready to become the saint's bodyguard. In addition, Georg said that the fact that they were standing here was already worthy of each of them guarding the holy girl day and night. And raising his hand up, the third George solemnly proclaimed that he was declaring the tournament to find bodyguards for the saint open. After that, the enthusiastic and joyful shouts of all the participants in the tournament were heard. But in addition to all the men who were there and happy for the opportunity to prove themselves, there lurked among them a small and insecure Georg IV, who was not laughing. The boy sighed, feeling fear of fighting and grown men. Georg is afraid that he will lose, for the adult knights are sure to be several times stronger than him. Georg remembers being shocked the previous day when the saint told him that he too would be participating. He fearfully pointed to himself, asking Sister Mary if it was true that the girl had told him to also compete. The little saint decided to respond by saying that she just wanted him to show his abilities in action for her sake. The saint decided to encourage the boy by ordering him to destroy all his rivals there and win, but the confused Georg wanted to ask the protagonist how he should defeat grown, strong people. The girl decided to answer this question by taking the boy's palm in her hand, showing on it many calluses from the hilt of the sword. The saint said that this was the reason she chose him as her guard. The protagonist, in the soft pink dress, explained to her astonished knight that it wasn't just his strength, but that she knew better than anyone how hard he tried when he was around her. Still holding Georg's hand and looking directly at him with her violet eyes, the saint with the soul of Lucifella, who sure knows how to cheer people up, especially her subjects, asked the knight to let everyone know that he would be her bodyguard. It was most likely the first time Georg heard such words addressed to him. He didn't know what to say, blushing and in mild shock at the sudden kindness and motivation from the saint. Then he told the girl in short phrase that he had received her orders. After those events, Georg spent a long time examining his calluses on his palms, preparing himself for the upcoming battles with experienced fighters. Clenching his palm into a fist, the boy swore in the saint's name that he would be the best of the best at today's tournament, even if the opponents were bigger and stronger than him by several times. As George IV waited his turn and prepared to show everyone what he could do, the other future knights who were nearby watching him began to gossip, marveling at the little boy among grown men. One of his buddies said he recognized him as the only child who had made it onto the list of contestants without passing the preliminaries. The other man scornfully replied that the red-haired boy was the son of paladins, so it was easy for him to bypass the selection trials by taking advantage of his connections. The fighter replied with a smirk that the little boy didn't have a single chance of winning, and his other friend, when it came to the selection trials, asked his colleague if there was even a person who had passed them the first time. As the chatty and engaged man answered his friend that he had heard of one such man, who seemed to be named Crom, a dark and tall silhouette loomed behind the character, who was none other than the Sin of Wrath himself. The two men turned around in fear and apprehension, and looked at the tall and dark blue man who was casting a creepy look on everyone around them. The two friends became agitated, not understanding what Crom wanted from them. With his terrifying eyes, the Sin of Wrath pierced the two gossipers, thus silencing them quickly, but Crom only menacingly asked them for permission to pass, not intending to linger long. On such an important day, the holy girl had been combed and groomed since morning, so that she would come out to the people clean and well-groomed like a true queen. And at the same time, the heroine was diligently reading a long paper, looking at it with an angry face because a man had asked her to do so. The girl kept reading while Omar told her that it was an accounting of the money received from the tournament. Sister Mary, who was nearby, warned Omar that the little girl might not fully understand exactly what he was showing her. But the little babe continued to stare at the paper report, which made it possible to guess that the little girl wasn't so uncomprehending of numbers and adult information. Unexpectedly, the girl was surprised when she said that 9,000 people came to the tournament, which is a big number. Omar and Sister Mary rejoiced and marveled at the girl's ability to understand big numbers, and Omar said that with the money they received, they could definitely repair their ruined temple. A joyful Omar decided to add that on top of all this, he also got a lot of proceeds from the sale of images of the saint, which he himself does. Omar said that the portraits of the holy girl are flying off the shelves of the counter as fast as hot cakes. At first, the girl was a little surprised that her face could make money, but then, when Omar said that now everyone had 10 copies of her face, and the Northern Kingdom had ordered another batch of portraits for 10,000 pieces, the girl was stunned, to say the least. The protagonist was in shock, not understanding how people who couldn't manage money properly and who hired guards without a salary could now spin their business so well. The holy girl said with embarrassment that both Maria, who had suggested the tournament idea, and Omar, who had planned the whole thing, were definitely talented people. Omar looked at the girl, not believing that he was hearing a compliment for himself. While Omar melted at the praise and nice words the saint was saying to him, the protagonist also confessed that she trusted him and ordered him to see to it that the money did not fall into the wrong hands. Motivated by the praise, Omar clenched his hand into a fist, showing his perseverance, determination by doing so. He said he would definitely do everything, to which the saint was mildly surprised, watching the priest with a smile. Omar left the beautiful and well-groomed girl alone, rushing to fulfill his duties. And the saint with the soul of Lucifella looked out the window and pondered whether she too should go to watch the competitions in the palace. At this time, all the future knights were already at the tournament venue. An exquisite statue of the holy goddess towered over the participants, which for everyone was a symbol of luck and fate on this important day. The place of battles in the tournament was not quiet. The participants showed their abilities by competing on wooden swords, which banged against each other when their owners tried to win first. The fighters tried their best to win without feeling pity for their opponents. They were focused on becoming the loyal and strongest knights who would become bodyguards for the saint. Thus, the participants were divided into pairs and competed against each other, showing off their skills. At the same time, they were watched by servants who were judges and decided who was stronger and who was weaker. Among the competitors who lost for the sake of being the guards of the saint, hiding behind boxes, watched everything the main character, trying to be inconspicuous. She wanted to watch the competition after all, leaving the palace. Looking carefully at everyone, the girl realizes that among the usual fighters may also be present and the scourge of Runabelt, that is, her friends. And there is a high probability that one of them could become her guard. The saint realizes that, if anything, a good candidate for her guard could be Jack, who already knows that the saint is Lucifella. Especially with the help of his spirit magic, she would be able to hide from the priests. The protagonist thought deeper and suggested that her new bodyguard could be Beatrice, who has a bold character and who is also loyal to her queen, that is Lucifella. But the saint is still not convinced. The little girl in the pink dress kept hiding behind boxes and watching everyone until one clerk loudly asked the candidates to introduce themselves before the first match. But then a chill ran through the saint, for she saw the one she least expected to see at the tournament. The girl looked at this man with her astonished eyes and remained silent. The man who had caught the girl's attention so much was standing right in front of her and had his back turned to her. The girl even rose from her seat to get a better look at him with a surprised face. Saint gradually recognized this man as her longtime and loyal friend Chroma, who still served the queen even after her death. She wonders if he guesses that the heroine is not just a saint, but the arch-rival Lucifella. Meanwhile, Crom remembers how and when he first met Lucifella. It was when she noticed him alone on the street, grudgingly and sadly telling her that the holy power of the temple dwellers was too strong and unpleasant. Crom had said that he was annoyed by their idleness all day long. The kind, powerful witch stroked Crom's head with the palm of her hand and reassured him, telling him that he should not compare himself to others. Lucifella, radiant with kindness, wished to give the unfortunate boy her warmth and care. She said that her family is the teacher in them, meaning the students. Her family is the 7 mages. Lucifella looked at Crom with a smile, promising that she would be everything to him. Those precious words made the boy not despair and gave him hope for a bright future. Crom continued to look at the witch with his gray eyes. Crum recalls how, as a little boy, he accidentally called Lucifella Lucidura, which made Jack laugh with embarrassment, and the witch looked at her new ward in surprise. However, immediately afterwards, the Archwitch punished Chroma for such inexcusable insolence by viciously kicking him in the ass, which surprised all the Queen's servants present at that moment. In addition to the embarrassing and funny events, Crom still remembers affectionately calling the Queen a short nickname like Lucy, showing the witch his happy smile. Crom gradually grew and changed for the better, learning to write and becoming more devoted to Lucifella, but he still addressed his queen as Lucy. As he became an adult, Crom adopted more masculine facial and character traits, strengthening his devotion to his queen, and now respectfully referring to her as Lucifella. Thus Crom, while becoming a real man, did not lose his love for and devotion to the queen. He, appearing at the tournament, is ready to fulfill any of Lucifella's wishes that she told him before her sad death. Crom boldly and decisively approached the servants, stating that his name was Crom Ackerson, and he was turning 18 this year. One servant girl covered her mouth with her hands when she saw such a charming man before her, and the other servants marveled at the new character. The protagonist was incredibly surprised when she heard Crom say his age, for she had thought until then that he was over 25. Still, he looks much younger than that. Lucifella isn't sure if this is the same Crom she called a lump of anger. Lucifella, a witch in the body of a saint, has convinced herself that this is not Crom at all, but another man. She is even surprised that these people have the same name and similar appearance. In addition, the heroine does not feel from him magical energy, which usually has villains. While the man who looks very similar to Crom in Lucifella's opinion stood up to fight with his opponent, holding a wooden sword in his hand, the protagonist realizes that if he wins this battle, then it is definitely the Crom she knows. The girl is about to witness the victory of one of the fighters, who has an equal chance to become her bodyguards. But then the girl noticed one detail about the tall man that caught her eye. From her memories, Lucifella remembered that long ago she had trained Chroma in sword fighting. She became in a confident stance, telling her student that he should not neglect some means and methods for the sake of victory. The heroine advised Crom to think of himself as a weapon and strike directly at his opponent's weak point. Crom, still keeping in his head the advice of the queen, became in exactly the same stance that Queen Lucifella taught him, and that was what surprised the protagonist. She realized that it was definitely Crom and no one else. While the girl watched Crom's every action, Sin of Wrath stood still, about to take the blow from his opponent, who, shouting, decided to strike first. But Crom wasn't even afraid of his opponent's boldness. He clenched the hilt of his sword with all his might in his palm, about to find his opponent's weakest point and strike back. Sin of Wrath let out all his anger and aggression, which could be seen in his distraught blue eyes. Swinging at his opponent, the man has no idea that he will greatly regret rushing in and underestimating Crom. With a single and very strong swing of his sword, Crom made his opponent not just scared. The sword that the man held in his hand flew off from the first blow, which shocked the fighter, but Crom realized that he was in a winning position. The man who dared to attack Crom first raised his hand, shaking with fear, looking at his opponent and not realizing how Crom had so much strength that with one blow his sword flew off his own hand. But here the opponent was even more surprised. Left without a sword, he thought that Crom would easily defeat him with a maximum of one technique and end the fight with his victory. But the Sin of Anger also threw his sword on the ground for an unknown reason. The frightened man wonders why he would do such a seemingly foolish act. Crom's opponent realized that if he picks up his sword from the ground now, he can easily overpower the brave man and win. Worried, that's exactly what he's going to do. But no matter how hard the man tried, he noticed that he was already losing the battle because the shadow of Crom's strong hand hovered right over his face. Mad with anger, Crom lunges at his opponent, about to grab him by the head and deliver the decisive blow. Crom does everything so quickly and professionally that the man has no time to react. In the next moment, while the fighter had no idea what could happen to him, Crom grabbed his opponent's face with his incredibly strong arm, about to slam him to the ground. Using only 2 strikes, Crom was able to slam his opponent's head against the stone surface without any problems, so that it cracked and scattered small shards around. This meant only one thing. Crom was definitely the winner of this battle. After the blow, the sweating and exhausted fighter screamed in pain all over the street, realizing that he had been defeated by a previously unknown type with one strong knockout. Crom continued to stare at his defeated opponent, who was definitely not going to get up, much less continue to fight a man as strong as Sin of Wrath. The tall and angry man in dark clothes threw his indifferent and confident look at the powerless man and said that his opponent was a real weakling. The lying fellow was finally overcome by Crom's victory. All this time, the female judge was watching the duel between the two men attentively and was even amazed by Crom's strength, which was written on her surprised face. But at that moment, the saint, who was also watching Crom, inadvertently made a sound, thus giving away her presence. Many people, including servants, fighters, and saints, noticed the shocked saint and rushed to her, asking her how she had gotten here, for they had not even known of her existence before. And the girl herself could not get away from her amazement after the knockout by which Crom had defeated her opponent. The little saint got the answer to the question why she could not feel Crom's magic mana. His mana only manifests when targeting enemies, and using a weapon, in this case a sword, is just a decoy for his opponent. While a crowd of people ran to the main character, wanting to see with their own eyes the holy child sent by the goddess, the saint continued to look at Crom, who did not run after everyone, but only stood mysteriously away from everyone. The girl was horrified to realize one fact that had creeped her out. Now, having learned more about the saint and demonstrated his incredible strength, Crom, under the guise of a bodyguard, came to her specifically to kill her. For this reason, the girl, being stunned, fell to the ground, realizing that her longtime and loyal friend is now her strongest and almost invincible killer. Thus, thanks to the competition, the judges had already figured out the two strongest fighters of all, who would have to fight each other to become the saint's personal knight. On the sheet were the fighters Crom and Georg. The two gossipers who were previously discussing Georg IV and Crom looked at the tournament results sheet, marveling that Georg was able to become the strongest of the strongest, including Crom. One of them admits that he didn't take the boy seriously, thinking he wouldn't advance far, but to the men's surprise, he turned out to be much more capable than they thought. But according to the buddies who kept looking at the images of the fighters, no matter how strong Georg was, he could not overcome the determined and serious Chroma, who was able to defeat his opponent with 2 punches. One of the gossipers justified this by adding that Georg and Crom have a big difference in strength, and Georg was also badly injured in today's tournament. It turned out to be just as the two men said. Little Georg had facial wounds covered with band-aids, an injured and bandaged arm and leg. The boy made it almost to the finals, but at the cost of his health. The boy recalls training to become stronger and being forced to do so by his father. Trying to become tougher, the boy constantly endured not only his father's strictness, but also bullying from others in training. George IV worked hard every day to satisfy his father's wishes, but the people judging him constantly laughed at him and his efforts. The young knight was hitting the mannequin with the artificial sword as hard as he could, venting all his aggression, while the mocking people said that he didn't need to be good at anything at all since he was from a powerful paladin family. But some judgmental people, on the contrary, said that it was just the opposite. He was weaker than everyone else and he needed to fix that. Georg continued to beat the hay dummy, remembering people's words about him not trying and only hoping for his family. And this tournament is just a regular show to show how he's trying, according to Georg's insulting personalities. Even more, Georg was angry at the words that he had no knightly blood in him at all, because he didn't even know how to fight. The boy was sweating because of his efforts, trying to achieve some success. Not to be judged, Georg hit the hay even harder until he broke his wooden sword in half. The boy was under incredible stress from the judgment, but it was what helped him become stronger. The boy only wished to catch his breath after a hard training session, but in his mind he couldn't get away from the words of the judgmental people who said that his participation in the tournament was unfair, because it was obvious that he was just shoved in here. Actually, because of these painful and cruel words of people in the society, wounded George sat in the palace with sadness, realizing that most likely he will not be able to participate in the tournament further and prove to the saint that he is worthy to be her knight. But quite unexpectedly, George, who had been sitting sadly in the palace, heard a familiar voice in front of him telling him that he knew he would be sitting here. Looking up, the saddened boy saw before him a saint with a beautiful pigtail and a white dress, who seemed to look at Georg with displeasure, for he had allowed himself to give up. George, who had no more strength left to fight and compete for the sake of the saint, sadly asked the protagonist to forgive him, and Lucifella asked him why she needed to forgive him because the decisive battle had not even begun. The little boy could no longer contain his emotions and let his tears come out. He cried right in front of the saint, for which he is surely ashamed, but he can't do anything about it. The blonde-haired queen was shocked to notice that George cried right in front of her and began to tremble. She couldn't even think of seeing her knight in such a state before, so she thought it was over since he was so tired. But on the other hand, the protagonist realizes that if she doesn't cheer him up now, her life may be in danger, because Crom also claims to be the knight of the saint, but in fact, he wants to kill the girl. In addition to this, the girl realizes the fact that her knight was having a hard time even before the words of encouragement. The heroine continues to watch hopelessly as the crippled George cries, wiping away tears with her hand. She doesn't want him to lose, so some kind of decision has to be made immediately. Suddenly, the saint hears Georg's confession that all he wanted to do was to show his abilities not only to the saint, but to everyone. The boy was hard-pressed by society, which had driven him into a frame of reference. A sad Georg wiped the tears from his cheeks, pouring from his eyes in rivers, adding to his words that he wanted to prove to everyone that he was even better. What the boy means is that he is not a wastrel or a weakling in the Paladin family, as those around him say about him. At this point, Lucifella remembers that she too felt similar feelings when she was living her past life. That day, when she was just learning magic and was very young, she felt a terrible sense of guilt. Her bearded teacher looked at the girl while the protagonist covered her face with her hands in shame and asked the teacher to forgive her because she had failed to perform one spell and thus damage one valuable thing for the teacher. The thing is that by Lucifella's mistake, who was teaching magic, the teacher's books, which he carefully kept, were burned in an instant and turned into ashes. The heroine felt incredible shame and guilt, causing her to tremble just as Georg was in front of her now. But while the little girl was washing away her tears of grief, her old teacher, who did not even spare his books or scold his student, calmly asked Lucifella if she knew the meaning of her name, which he had given her. The old man teacher kindly placed his palm on the top of the girl's head, saying that her name is like infinite magic, like the morning sun, like the moon that disappears and reappears. The teacher told the protagonist that her name means light. But suddenly, amidst the last words, Lucifella recalled a memorable and tragic memory also related to the teacher. When large white flags with a blue, complex emblem were flying in the air, the same teacher who had supported and made the protagonist happier was proclaiming to the people that he hoped they would never know sorrow. The teacher, dressed in strong iron armor and waving his magic staff at people, added that he wished that everyone present would be happy. It was as if he was on the scene of some tragedy or battleground. The main character, who at that moment was the real red-haired Lucifella, was carefully watching the teacher's staff, whose magic ball had cracked. Lucifella did not take her eyes off the bloody staff or the teacher. It felt like a person had been killed with that same staff on that tragic day, or perhaps someone had been sacrificed with it. Beside the teacher, someone's body lay lifelessly bleeding, while Bahman himself was busy addressing the people and speaking. Most likely, the teacher had taken someone's life. Finished recalling the difficult memories of her past life, Lucifella's thoughts made her remember her teacher's face again, which was not trustworthy and whose eyes were dark. The teacher had smilingly rejoiced that Lucifella hadn't gotten hurt the first time she tried to learn magic. The heavy memories let go of the little girl, and she snapped back to reality. Out of anger at something or someone, she clenched her palm into a fist, silently considering what she wanted to say to Georg. Crying Georg IV suddenly felt a small hand on his head. Lucifella decided to support the boy as kindly and touchingly as her teacher had once done. The girl's caress made Georg stop crying and look at her. The girl continued to stroke Georg's hair, even though the boy was visibly embarrassed. But it did nothing better to help him calm down and stop crying. Still stroking Georg's bodyguard on the head, the holy girl told him that he had done a great job, then called him her knight. Georg really needed someone's support, so he listened to the girl, looking her straight in the eyes. The kind protagonist looked at the bandaged hands of the boy, explaining to him that he was still a child, and he would have 1,000,001 more chances to prove his superiority and strength. The girl was also looking at Georg's bandaged right leg, continuing to reassure him that the fact that he had failed this time was not such a big problem, because as long as a man lives, he meets both successes and failures on his way. While the boy was about to cry all over again, the happy and smiling girl added to her words that she noticed perfectly well how hard he was trying, and that was enough. Georg couldn't just sit there and listen to nice words from the main character. He fell to his knees in front of her and hugged her tightly, which shocked and frightened Lucifella a bit in the saint's body. While the boy hugged the supportive saint tightly, the little sweet girl guessed, saying that he must have been hoarding everything inside him for so long that he was now crying right in front of the person who had shown him attention and care. The girl and Georg cuddled up sweetly in the palace so that the little knight could find the strength and motivation to fight in the final battle for the title of the saint's personal knight. Although Lucifella realizes that the Holy Temple is her enemy, she can't be cruel to Georg because of her strong affection. But then the girl remembered her fond memories, that her teacher had also hugged her tenderly when she didn't believe in herself and when she didn't succeed. Lucifella thought that perhaps she did not feel angry with Georg for the reason that these light feelings were familiar to her. As the magical sunlight shone in the palace, illuminating all the whitewashed walls, windows, and other objects, the holy girl asked Georg not to tell anyone that she had cured all his injuries with divine power. The holy girl's holy hand, emitting a divine golden light, treated George IV's injured forearm. The saint girl confessed that she didn't want him to lose because of his injuries. Therefore, the girl asked him to fight in such a way that there would be no defeat later. George clenched both palms into a fist and with an attuned look accepted the saint's order, stopping crying. The protagonist marvels at how quickly he came to his senses. Cheerful George got up from his seat and already wanted to go to the palace, telling the saint that he would take her to the bedroom, but the heroine coquettishly replied that it should not be done, and she came alone on purpose, so she will return alone. The boy could not answer anything to his queen, but at such moments he always felt that the saint was like an adult, not a child, which she is now. The saint was already planning to leave, or rather run away from her knight, whom she saved with magic. But then George said to the girl, "Thank you very much," which made the protagonist turn around. The cute girl turned to Georg IV and dazzled him with her smile, beautiful hair, and voice, and told him that she would only accept the words of thanks after his victory at the final battle. After a pleasant meeting with her personal knight, the saint strolled through the corridors of the large and beautiful castle. She said that she knew the way and would reach the bedroom by herself, and it turned out to be true. The girl did not want to distract Georg from battles and also did not want him to always run after her. The saint, with Lucifella's soul, was walking down the corridor and realized that she had spent almost all of her divine powers on healing Georg, which made her feel sluggish and tired. The girl would probably want to rest on the soft bed in her room right now. Coming to her room, the door of which happened to be open, the saint noticed Sister Mary walking around, calling and looking for the holy girl. Noticing her, the girl already wanted to respond. But as soon as the girl raised her hand and told Mary that she was already here, the unknown hooded man grabbed the defenseless saint in his evil arms to kill her. Sister Mary never heard the poor holy girl, who was firmly grasped by the stranger. The murderer covered the protagonist's mouth, which made her unable to say anything, and then he dragged her away from the room and Mary. The stranger quietly ordered the saint to close her mouth, while he himself prevented her from saying anything. Though he grabbed her very tightly from behind her back, the heroine started kicking hard, causing the kidnapper a problem. The saint wondered how the suicide bomber managed to sneak into the palace so quickly. No matter how hard the kidnapper held the girl in his grip, the saint was not about to give up, being grabbed in the most unexpected place. She bit him hard on the hand that the assassin used to cover her mouth, causing him to scream in pain. While the kidnapper held on to his sore palm and felt the unpleasant pain, the protagonist was able to free herself from the suicide bomber and began to crawl further away from him. Saint recalls that she always immediately notices the bright energy of the assassin, so she notices their appearance. The kidnapper noticed that the Saint is just like a skillet. She is not going to wait to be rescued, but makes the right decisions on her own, just like adults. The murderer, looking at the girl, notices that she begins to take her divine power against him. All around, and the girl herself glows with divine power, about to strike the suicide bomber hard. The Saint is confident that no matter how strong the killer is, she, using her magic, will be able to defeat each of them. But what was the girl's surprise when she realized that her divine power had no effect on the kidnapper at all? She was amazed at this as she continued to stare at the hooded suicide bomber. Nothing really happened to the suicide bomber. No matter how much divine power the girl used, he continued to stand and stare and at the Saint while the girl wondered the logical question of why he was still in one piece. Suddenly, the suicide bomber began to move closer and closer to the girl defenseless before him, not even paying attention to how much divine power she had expended. The Saint ponders that the kidnapper should have fallen by now, but it didn't happen. The Saint wonders that perhaps there are people who can withstand the attack of her magic. The girl was finally frightened when the kidnapper's hand reached out to grab the Saint and do with taking her life. The Saint, in fear, wanted to run away from the killer, not knowing what to do. But it was too late to run. In the next moment, the kidnapper was still able to reach the Saint by grabbing her with his hand in the hallway. The kidnapper was able to lay the girl on the floor with one palm, and at this point the sweeper said that he finally realized how the Saint had dispensed with all the previous assassins. The girl glared angrily at the mortal, already guessing why he was not affected by her strong attack with divine power and why he was still alive, standing on his feet. The Saint, looking angrily at the suicide bomber, whose eyes and smile cast eeriness and fear, said that he was not just her killer, but a priest among others. The suicide bomber angrily told the Saint that if it weren't for her, the temple would have been in their hands long ago. Suddenly, from under his body, the suicide bomber pulled out a dagger, with which he was going to take the life of the weak and helpless Saint. The kidnapper smilingly admitted that now it no longer matters that their temple was not in his hands from the beginning. The protagonist realizes that no one can help her anymore. The shadow of a sharp dagger blade looms over her, and since the girl has already used so much divine magic, she won't have the strength to resist. She can only hope for the best possible outcome of events. The evil suicide bomber already swung at the protagonist with a crazy smile, saying his crowning phrase that the Saint here and now will complete her short and tragic life journey. But the kidnapper did not yet know that his devious plans are not destined to come true. All to blame, right behind the embittered kidnapper appeared the large and dark figure of another man, who immediately swung at the suicide bomber, intending to put him down with a single blow. A moment later, the suicide bomber who had wanted to kill the girl was already lying unconscious on the floor, and the saintly, terrified girl stood up, looking at the one who had now saved her life. The astonished girl was looked at by the equally astonished Crom, who was able to protect the saint, or rather his queen, from death. The protagonist instantly recognized her longtime friend, and she also realized the fact that he did not actually want to kill her as a saint, and even on the contrary, he wanted to protect her. But for what reason? While the girl was in incredible shock at the events, Crom, apparently out of embarrassment, started a conversation, admitting how uncomfortable he felt in front of her. Saint looked at Crom with surprise, realizing the situation she was in. Suddenly, Crom knelt in front of the saint, going to talk to her. This shocked the protagonist, because Crom, who is now the ruler of Runabelt, should kill the saint, because all saints are enemies to him. But he is not even going to raise a hand against the girl. Looking the little girl straight in the eyes, Crom told her a deep, interesting, and very mysterious phrase, asking her why she became like this. The heroine didn't fully understand exactly what Crom meant, but when he addressed her by the name Lucifella, everything fell into place. At this point, Lucifella recalls one important episode from her past life, namely how she played a game of chess together with Crom and told him a touching, sad story. Lucifella confessed to Crom that she did not believe in love. Lucifella explained her position with the fact that even those who swore they would give up the whole world for her and those who promised to love her in the next life didn't even recognize her when she was born again. With those words, A pawn piece fell from the heroine's palm onto the chessboard. Picking up the pawn, Lucifella once again told Crom that all the words and promises she had heard to her were simple lies and nothing more. The protagonist would have continued playing chess and telling her stories quietly if she hadn't noticed that Crom was suspiciously long and sadly silent. The witch Lucifella looked at Crom, who didn't even have a face from listening to the queen's story, and asked why he had become so sullen and if there was something he was unhappy about. As Crom clutched his palm on the table, the protagonist took notice. The sin of anger said that he just couldn't have fun after hearing a sad, love-related story from the queen. Crom confessed to the arch-rival Lucifella that he would never under any circumstances make such a mistake, which were made by people from the heroine's past lives, who swore to her in love and in the end forget about her forever. Lucifella did not expect to hear her loyal friend show such concern and sympathy from him, and because of this, the heroine looked into his eyes with slight confusion. The protagonist recalls that such a serious reaction from a grown boy to such a light conversation threw her off a bit, but it made the heroine remember Chroma's promise for years to come, which her loyal friend and servant fulfilled. The saint with the soul of Lucifella realized that even the best and most experienced mages with incredible powers could not recognize the queen in her, and Crom, using only the power of spirits, recognized Lucifella in her from the first time. As the stunned heroine looked at Crom, he asked her once more why she was in that form, addressing her as Lucifella. Crom looked silently at the girl and waited for her to answer, but the astonished saint only asked him again, seemingly not understanding what he was trying to tell her. Addressing Lucifella as you, Crom once again asked her if she remembered what had happened to her and who she was. The girl continued to look at Crom with feigned disdain, still lying on the floor. At this point it dawned on the girl, for she asked herself to think hard about not showing her embarrassment to Crom, for by it he could easily guess that he recognized her. In addition, the heroine realizes that if he can guess that she is not just a saint, but Lucifella, Crom at any cost will try to take her with him, and, in an even worse development of events, will try to start a war against the saints for taking away his queen. Then, judging by Lucifella's thoughts, the city will be in the very epicenter of the war, and this is very bad, because in this case, she will not be able to find the forbidden magic, which is so dreamed of and with her can say goodbye. The girl understood this while Crom patiently stood before her on one knee and waited for the saint to speak to him. Lucifella realizes that the situation needs to be saved urgently, but she doesn't even have a plan. Realizing that action must be taken, the saint clenched her small palm into a fist, trying to say something to Crom that would deflect his suspicions of her being Lucifella in the other direction. Deciding to pretend that she didn't know anything and she was just a simple girl with divine powers, Lucifella made herself cute and admitted to Crom that she was just so scared that she cried. While the girl continued to act like a silly and ignorant little girl who was happy that the knight had saved her from the kidnapper, Crom looked at Lucifella with a petrified, serious face. He had expected anything but such acting from the saint he thought was Lucifella. In fact, the protagonist laughed with Chroma's reaction, who created a throwaway atmosphere with his face. Lucifella is convinced that if it was magic, everything around would instantly turn to ice just from Chrome's face. While the saint and Crom were trying to understand each other in the hallway, Sister Mary, who had been searching for the girl all over the room until that moment, finally spotted the protagonist along with a large man in the doorway. Sister Maria approached the saint and Crom in shock, asking what they had going on here. Crom, as well as the Diachka, turned to the old woman while the girl's face even showed some relief for her arrival. Examining the little girl's face, Sister Mary excitedly said that she had slightly hurt herself, before asking if something dangerous had happened to her. The protagonist replied that she was fine, and that the man standing next to her had saved her. Crom got up from his knee, realizing that now the saint is definitely not threatened by anyone. It was the first time Sister Mary saw such an unusual, strict, strong, and handsome knight like Crom. Sister Maria looked at Crom with mesmerized amazement, while the Dark Knight warned her that most likely one of the temple dwellers was going to kill the saint, and since that suicide bomber who just wanted to make an attempt on the saint had lost consciousness, he could be interrogated and the one in charge could be revealed. Mary told Crom that she understood his words and thanked the knight heartily for daring to save the precious life of the saint. At the same time, the saint herself was staring intently at her savior, keeping her eyes fixed on him. Crum was also gazing at the saintly girl, apparently guessing everything she was trying to hide and keep silent from him. But the protagonist could never know if he recognized Lucifella in her unless she asked him directly and dispelled his doubts. Leaving the saint with Mary, Crom once again asked the girl to forgive him for some unknown reason. After the terrible and unexpected series of events, much time had already passed, and gradually everyone in the palace learned that an assassination attempt was being prepared on the saint, which, fortunately, did not come to pass. One of the first to learn of this news was Saint Father Bachman, who was staying in a beautiful room with flowers. Father Bachman was dumbfounded by the news that the Holy Girl, the most precious person for all mankind, was about to be murdered by an unknown mortal who was walking around the palace easily, being a stranger among his own. Sister Mary has alerted the Holy Father and Oman that the saint is safe for the moment, but they have yet to find the mastermind behind the crime. Therefore, Maria suggests that the finale be postponed because of security concerns. Omar agreed with Mary's words, saying that it is better to suspend all temple activities until they find the main traitor. The important conversation of the temple figures was interrupted by a childish voice that addressed Sister Maria and Holy Father Bachman by their first names. The old woman and the elder looked at the little girl. The little saint was admiring the view from the window, and all the while listening intently to the conversation of the adults. She turned to them, telling them that she was fine, and suggested that the finale be held at the time it was scheduled for. Saint Father Bachman wanted to gently object to the girl, reminding her that the situation was still dangerous, but the persistent saint moved closer to the adults and explained that there were people who looked down on her, and so they should make her existence loudly known at this tournament. In fact, the girl certainly didn't want to be reborn in the body of a saint, but she has absolutely no desire to die at the hands of strangers. On that basis, she insists on a tournament so that she can have a personal night. The Holy Father only looks at the protagonist, not going to oppose her anymore and accepting her position. After all, she is above him in status, and thus her opinion is also important. The priest placed his palm on her chest, intending to bow before the saint and thus agree with her. After bowing before the child, who is the hope of a bright future and salvation from evil for the whole country, the Holy Father kindly reminded the saint that they will always protect her and keep her safe from every evil eye and criminal. After that, the Holy Father turned to the servants in a flash, and after extending his hand at them, he ordered them to strengthen the guards even more, and if they saw anyone suspicious or anyone with magic, they would immediately stop the tournament. The Holy Father admitted that they shouldn't forget that the holy was more important to them than anything else. The guards meekly said that Bachman's errands would be done in Blinken, then she left to carry out the obligatory order. The girl felt uncomfortable with the realization that those who fought her in her past life and those who wanted to destroy her now do not even doubt that she is a saint and will save them all from evil, although it is far from true. But the girl has a logical question. If people still believe in her and that she is a holy child sent by the goddess, then how could Crom easily recognize her just by looking into her eyes? The main character will be tormented by this question for a long time. And most importantly, then, why would the girl hide her true identity if everything falls into place by itself? The girl kept thinking about what real purpose she was pursuing until she appeared in front of people in a luxurious white and blue dress. In front of the girl, Crom and Georg were already in the battle arena. They were the strongest of the strongest who had made it through the tournament and reached the finals. And now they were to fight each other for the right and honor of being a Knight of the Holy. Lucifella watched them and prepared to make a speech. The spectators, who were lucky enough to watch the legendary duel, raised a ruckus when they noticed the saint's appearance. They were already eager to begin the decisive battle for the title of the saint's personal bodyguard. Saint Father Bachman and Sister Mary were also present like this. They feel strongly for the saint, which is evident on their faces. But the saint, in which Lucifella's soul is encased, will do her job without even knowing what Crom is up to. The girl looked determinedly and boldly at the two fighters and the hall of people, as if she were not a child at all, but an adult. Georg had already felt this energy from her, but now almost everyone would have a chance to feel it in the arena. The saint began her solemn speech by saying that the fighters' bodies were all scarred, and it showed that they had worked very hard to get this far. Little Georg saluted the saint, keeping his hand on his chest and looking directly at her. Krom was also listening to the saint's words, preparing to fight Georg IV. He was clearly thinking about something, but remained mysteriously silent as he listened to the voice of the saint, who continued to say that everyone who was here now was supporting them and cheering them on. After sharing her words with the fighters and everyone present, the saint gracefully raised her hand up and loudly wished Krom and George glory and blessings in this fight, announcing that the final round of George IV against Krom was about to begin. As Lucifella had said earlier, Krom only manifests his mana when he attacks his opponent and only uses his weapons as bait. And in this case, Krom's sword also began to emit a magical blue light, similar to smoke, which meant that Georg was not going to have it easy. Fighting already with real swords, Georg tried his best to break Krom's will by attacking first. But Krom, who clearly had more experience in fighting, easily dodged the boy's blows. Krom really disliked the unpleasantness of the divine power, but he continued to sword fight with the boy with a nonchalant face, without showing any emotion. Georg was also trying as hard as his opponent. He gave him blow after blow, not even intending to give up. Sweat was already dripping down his face from his efforts, but it was only the beginning. The saint was carefully watching everyone from the balcony, and Saint Father Bachman was also near her. At one point, he asked the girl who she thought deserved to win. The saint replied that if she had the opportunity, she would make sure that they both won. The astonished father questioned the girl about her last words, but she was already immersed in her own thoughts, watching the duel attentively. The girl thought that George IV and Krom were two completely different people, but they were both worthy to win. There is a reason the girl told Bachman that she wants them both to win. She compares them to expensive stones. George is like a rough, just-born diamond, and Chroma is the opposite. In contrast, the protagonist compares Krom to a finished and exquisite piece of jewelry. The girl compared them to stones by observing both their skills and endeavors. Georg is an uncut diamond to the protagonist because he has honed his training, skills, and strength since childhood. He still has a lot to learn and a lot of room to try. But Chroma, unlike Georg, already has honed skills in fighting and battles that require absolutely no edits because they are perfect. Hence the comparison to a finished piece of jewelry. He is talented from magic to swordsmanship, and so he will easily destroy any of Georg's endeavors. Thoughts of Krom made the protagonist once again recall old memories of her past life. There was a moment in her hard life when Krom managed to summon a beautiful stone bird with magic, which he showed to Lucifella. Showing the magical bird to the protagonist, Krom wondered to her if he had done everything right while Lucifella looked at the magical creature with amazed eyes. Krom smiled, pleased, and also told Lucifella that he had a hard time the first time, but when the protagonist explained everything well to him, he succeeded the first time. Lucifella continued to stare at the magic bird in surprise with her mouth ajar. She didn't even think that her student would say such nice words to her. She could feel important. In addition, Krom admitted that he had succeeded only because of her. Because of this, the protagonist remembered these events even being in another life. That time, the heroine praised Krom, saying that he had done a good job. And this time, while watching him, she would have said the same thing if she had the chance. But the saint only continued to watch the two knights duel. While fighting for the title of being the Saint Girl's Knight, at one moment Krom stared intently at the most precious to the Saint Girl, who is actually his reborn queen. Krom silently wondered what the person who was the reason he was here was thinking right now. Distracted by the saint, Sin of Wrath seemed to have begun to forget that he had a battle to fight. The black-haired fighter and mage could have paid in an instant for allowing himself to divert his attention to the saint, for right in front of his face flew a sharp blade that could have easily ended the fight with Krom's defeat. But at the same moment, Krom was able to strike back, making the boy doubt his abilities even more. Krom was not about to give up and would not even give in to the young man. However, Georg was not the most ordinary and weak boy from the street either. With a swing of his sword, he was able to graze Krom's face against the very edge of the point, making a scratch on the face of the Sin of Wrath. Krumm had not expected such a turn, which left him seriously stunned. Georg realized the important thing that he had to look for his opponent's weakness, and not just fight. As the battle continued, Georg thought that if he waited just a little longer, he would be able to find his opponent's weakness and strike a decisive blow. But while Georg already seemed to know the formula for winning the contest, Krumm seemed to switch and increase his strength. This frightened the boy, but did not diminish his efforts one bit. Georg did not understand Krumm's behavior, but he tried so hard that his hands began to tremble with power. Krumm's strength became so great that the boy could barely stay in one place. His legs were trembling trying to withstand his opponent's onslaught, but Georg kept himself from about to give up. Suddenly, Krumm spoke to Georg in his scary and serious voice. He asked the boy a rhetorical question, asking why he should participate in this gunfight. The sweating boy was already frightened by this. Looking into Georg's eyes with his anger-stricken gaze, Horm also said angrily that his patience was running out. With these words, he wants to say that now Georg will be finished, and Horm will decide the outcome of the fight with one blow, which is his favorite trick. But the plans to end the battle with one blow were interrupted by a sudden and terrifying scream of a man who was at the side of the saint. Krumm flashed his eyes to the side of the sound to see what had happened. Krumm was no longer concerned with the battle or Georg, for the picture he saw made him lightning fast and incredibly surprised at the same time. Like all the spectators, Krumm, Georg, and the others, they saw a saint falling from a high balcony, who in a fraction of seconds should fall to the ground and be badly maimed and maybe even die. Krumm noticed the falling saint at the same moment. He no longer cared about the battle or the tournament at all, as he only had saving the saint on his mind, which he was going to do. 5 minutes before these nightmarish events, everything was smooth. The spectators were watching the battle of the two warriors along with the saint and other important people in the temple. 2 guards were guarding the exit to the balcony where the saint was with the Holy Father and Mary, but out of the blue, an employee ran up to them who clearly had some news. Even Father Bachman noticed the servant who was so eager to break in and inform the higher-ups of something. She appeared before the Holy Father, apologizing and saying that she had only come running for a minute. The attendant bowed to the Holy Father in a hurry, informing him that something had collapsed in the temple during the repair work, so guests and employees were trapped inside. While the guards were by her side, the clerk also said that the priests alone would not be strong enough to rescue them. Sister Mary became agitated upon hearing such news, and St. Father Bachman only seriously replied that he would go to their aid. Bachman warned everyone that in order to avoid an accident, it was necessary for someone to stay with the saint and guard her. The servant girl excitedly echoed the Holy Father. Bachman then turned to the saint, suggesting that she should interrupt urgently, but the little girl did not hear the old man's voice and did not even turn toward him. The Holy Father, looking at the saint, could not understand why the little girl ignored him, but then he guessed, and everything fell into place. The thing is, the little girl is too focused on Krumm and Georg's battle. She's been watching them since the beginning, and she just doesn't react to anything else anymore. Maria and Bachman smiled when the old woman said that the little girl was too focused on the competition to hear them. To Maria and Bachman's sister, it turned out to be quite cute. The girl watched the fighters Krumm and Georg closely. She sees and realizes that Krumm's skills are vastly superior, but Georg tries not to back down. The protagonist was indeed heavily focused on the competition between the two fighters, who were actually her friends. Comparing them to rocks, remembering their past lives, watching their skills, she was not at all interested in what was going on around her. While the heroine was thinking about what would happen to Krumm if Georg came out victorious, the servant who had come running to alert everyone to the problem, for some reason came closer to the saint. Sister Mary noticed this, but thought she wanted to say something to her. The shadow of an employee who was up to something was already looming over the unsuspecting saint. The guards ordered her to stand still, but she didn't listen to the orders, walking closer to the heroine. This time, the saint noticed her presence. When the clerk came closer, she not only loomed menacingly over her, but she also held out her hands, about to do something terrible. The saint still thought all was well. But then the servant girl, showing the saint her evil smile and crazy pink eyes, proclaimed to the girl that the saint's death would lead to the fall of Bachman. The servant girl is none other than another suicide bomber who wants to kill the saint. Sister Mary realized the mistake she had made by allowing one of the servants to get close to the saint. Mary in shock wanted to warn the girl, as did the other guard, but it was too late. The saint realizes that she has nowhere to run from the servant girl who wants her dead. Being on the balcony, she has too little time to react and use divine power. With a push of one hand, the servant was able to push the saint off the high balcony, causing her to fall from a deadly height. While everyone shouted "Saint" in shock, the girl was able to say goodbye to her life in a matter of seconds. The saint fell helplessly to the ground while her mind was spinning with the thought of whether or not she would die such a ridiculous and stupid death now. The girl did not believe in her death. Would her life in the body of a saint end so quickly and senselessly that no one could even understand anything? The heroine is in despair and shock because she can no longer change anything and only a miracle will help her now. The protagonist is ashamed because for all her short life she has not done anything useful, not even found forbidden magic. And she was always treated like a child, and in her life as a saint there were many things humiliating. But still the protagonist thinks it was not a bad life. No matter how much the girl did not say goodbye to life, still, a miracle happened. From below there were already hands that were preparing to save the saint from death. While all the spectators stood in shock and watched the unexpected turn of the battle, amazing events occurred in the arena that no one expected. The saint opened her eyes, not understanding why she didn't die instantly and why she was feeling absolutely no pain right now. The girl feels and realizes that she is not in pain for the reason that she landed on something soft. But what could it be, also in the middle of a battle arena? As she stood up from the ground, the girl saw a startling sight. The one she landed on was Crom, who was lying on the ground and showing no signs of life. There were bruises on his arms and body in general. But then the girl realized, she remembered that even with magical power, the body of a magician is not different from that of an ordinary person, which means that Crom, despite the fact that he is a strong magician, can get the same injuries as ordinary people. Saint has tried to awaken Crom by calling his name and touching his hand, but all to no avail. She realizes that catching a falling man with his body is not an easy task. Suddenly the girl heard Crom mutter something to her, though, which made her shocked. The girl stepped away from Crom as she continued to listen to what he was muttering. The protagonist was wary, for the words Crom wanted to say to her after the rescue were clearly not ordinary. Lucifella continued to remain silent as she looked at the injured Crom. The words that he said only to her made the heroine look at him with amazement. Meanwhile, one priest with a flag in his hands had already run up to the protagonist, who was supposed to announce the results of the battle. He looked at Crom and drew conclusions, about to pronounce the verdict. After a moment, the referee proclaimed that the combatant named Crom was disqualified for stepping outside the competitive field, and the winner of the battle was George IV. Crom continued to lie exhaustedly on the ground with his eyes closed. The attendants who were in a daze examined the injured Crom. They shrieked that both of the fighters' arms were broken and also requested that the others call for healers as soon as possible. One woman ran up to the saint, anxiously asking her if she had hurt herself in the fall. But the girl kept looking at Crom and pondering the words he had said to her. But then the girl heard the voices of others condemning George and his victory. They were saying that he may have won, but it wasn't a real victory. Unknown individuals were condemning the little boy who was going to be the saint's personal bodyguard. Disgruntled onlookers even suggested that the rumors about everything being bribed were true and the whole thing was a circus. The saint listened intently to the strangers' conversations, as did the woman. Saint immediately turned around, for she realized that George IV was also hearing these painful words. She noticed that he was still standing on the field with his sword in his hand and his head down, listening to the disgruntled spectators. Little Georg, who was trying his best to win the victory, was listening to the words of the spectators who were saying that a little boy like him couldn't be the personal knight of a saint. Such words made Georg's hands begin to shake from stress. The protagonist decided not to hesitate for a second and ran to Georg, while the woman with glasses tried to stop her, shouting after her and asking her where she was going. But it was very important for the girl to support the young boy. George IV still stood in the arena and listened to the condemnations of the people with shame. He wished to sword fight fairly, but he did not wish to win by such a shameful method. It didn't matter to the boy whether he won or lost, because he wanted to test his strength and endurance to prove to himself that he wasn't nothing. Practicing around the clock in front of a mannequin, George IV wants to be honest and not win fencing by any other means than a fair fight. But fate has turned its back on him. By showing his abilities, he wanted to prove to everyone that he could claim the title of Knight Saint. He especially wanted to prove it to those who had judged him from the beginning. But all the boy had to do was to accept the victory, which in reality was a defeat for him. He lowered his head in his hands, realizing that he had failed to show his best side. Georg's hand grew weak with helplessness, sadness, and shame, about to drop his sword to the ground. Thoughts flew in his head that he probably didn't have an ounce of the dignity he was so eager to show everyone. But the boy's sadness was interrupted by a saint who rushed over to help him. Beside him, he felt something touch his hand, which he was surprised by. George IV saw the saint take his hand, preventing him from dropping his sword and thus surrendering. The boy asked the saint a question about this, but she answered nothing. The protagonist continued to keep the boy's palm clenched so that he would in no way allow himself to let go of the sword he was fighting with. Holding Georg's hand together with the hilt of the sword, the saint realized that she hadn't meant for things to go this way, but now that the competition was over, she couldn't leave it like this. Determined, the girl prepared herself for her own verdict, removing the large blue jewelry from her hair. The girl removed the decorations from her golden hair, letting the wind develop her strands. She wasn't going to agree with the judge's decision, especially since both Krumm and Georg were equally important to her. Standing next to Georg and still holding his hand, the girl began to emit a magical light, thus attracting the attention of the audience. She began her speech by swearing in the name of the holy goddess Esperia. All the spectators directed their gazes at the saint and Georg, and fell silent, listening to what the girl was saying. And she told everyone that she watched not only the fight, but also saw the honest endeavor and dedication of each fighter. And for this reason, according to the saint, in honor of the courage of George IV and Chroma, she appointed them both as personal knights. Little Georg was astonished to hear the personal verdict of the heroine. Georg wanted to object to the heroine, trying to say that he really did not win and has no honor, but the saint quickly interrupted him, replying that she did not want to hear that he did not deserve it. They are not in a comedy situation. But the girl, smiling slyly, asked Georg if he now wished to challenge her decision. Realizing that out of politeness Georg would not be able to answer her something, the heroine continued talking further. The protagonist went on to say that, like Krumm, Georg had done an excellent job. These owls made tears appear in the boy's eyes. The little girl turned around sharply, noticing that Krumm had managed to move Krumm. No matter how hard she tried over Georg, Krumm also worried her just as much. Krumm was carried away on a stretcher while the saint concluded that they would both be able to protect her in the future. Sin of Wrath might have lost consciousness from the fracture of both arms, but still he was conscious. While still conscious, Krumm began to remember his first encounters with Lucifella and how he had waited for her arrival all these long years. Krumm remembers being very young and how he met Lucifella. That day, sunset was already falling on the temple near where the little boy was. Lucifella was showing Krumm a magic trick with the appearance of a stone bird, while demonstrating everything on herself. The girl had a magic ball glowing in her hand, while the heroine herself was asking the homeless boy if he liked it. Little Lucifella told the boy to imagine that he was gathering all the power in his hand and making a buh, after which a bird-like creature like this would appear. The girl once again explained to the boy that if you do as she said, it will definitely appear, but Krumm only said that the advice of the protagonist is very inaccurate. But the protagonist had no time for explanations. She threw a bag of groceries to Krumm, saying that she had to go because the teacher was waiting for her. And lastly, Lucifella asked the boy to take the bag she had just given him. As she was leaving little Krumm and waving to him, Lucifella said that she would bring more food later. But for now, let Krumm share it with the boys. Krumm was very surprised and happy about the girl's gift, so he wasn't going to just stay silent and see off the main character with a look. Krumm called out Lucifella, calling her sis, to which the protagonist instantly turned around. Embarrassed, Krumm embarrassedly told the protagonist his name, holding her gift tightly in his hands. After that, the boy inquired as to the heroine's name. Of course, Lucifella couldn't go away leaving such a sweet and kind boy without an answer. She looked at him with pleasant emotions, about to say her name. The main character answered Krumm with a smile that her name was Lucifella, and her beautiful name means light. Almost every day, Lucifella visited the place where little Crom lived, along with other homeless people. One of the homeless men in need of help recognized her as the apprentice of the great mage, who came to see him today as well. Lucifella replied to the elderly, white-haired man that she had brought a little more this time than before, and asked the old man to share with those suffering from hunger. While the homeless man told Lucifella that he thanked her as he always did, and while he confessed that he didn't know how he would have lived without her and the great wizard, they were watched by Crom, who was also greatly anticipating the appearance of the protagonist. The boy continued to gaze at the young Lucifella while the man told her to pass on his thanks to her teacher Runabelt. But as stealthy as Crom was, Lucifella was still able to spot him, using her magic to appear unexpectedly from behind. Appearing behind little Crom's back, she asked him why he was hiding. Lucifella, illuminating a golden glow, told the boy that they had seen each other before and asked him again if the boy's name was Crom. Meanwhile, the future sin of wrath was holding on to his heart and couldn't catch his breath from the intense fright. Holding a new bag of groceries in her hand, Lucifella told the boy with a smile that she had been looking for him for a long time, and thankfully he had finally been found. The kind apprentice mage, Runabelt, held out the bag of assorted goodies to Crom, reminding him to share it with his friends. The blue-haired boy couldn't believe the generosity of the girl, who once again treated him without asking for anything in return. Finally, the girl said that if it wasn't enough for Crom, let him come to her or his teacher, and they would give him more food. The boy was embarrassed by the simple man's kindness to him, so he kept silent. But then Crom said something that surprised little Lucifella. Crom asked her if they themselves would have enough food if they shared it with others so often. Lucifella knelt in front of the boy while Crom shared her worries that the Emperor might not like it, and the mage Runabelt might get in trouble for feeding common commoners. But the red-haired girl stood up and firmly stated that nothing of the sort would happen, even though he looked down on everyone. Crom was a little frightened by Lucifella's assertiveness. In addition, the girl proclaimed in no uncertain terms that no matter what happened, Teacher Runabelt would always protect her. The red-haired girl is 100% confident in her teacher, and it fascinates little Crom. After reassuring Crom with her promise, Lucifella also cheerfully told the boy that she herself is very strong, so she need not fear the wrath of the Emperor and others. The blue-haired boy was struck by Lucifella's confidence and firmness so much so that he looked at her with his mouth open. He realized that he should not remain in debt. Based on that thought, Crom decided that he wanted to please his little sister Lucifella with something that could make her happy so that she would smile just as much as she did at that memorable moment. In the next flashback, Crom recalls events no longer as vivid and colorful as meeting Lucifella. Under the black sky that day, there were various flags hanging, which gave the impression that there had been a big, decisive battle in which many people lost their lives. Aside from the flags, there were also swords lying on the ground, which were the weapons of a terrible battle. Some of them were sticking out of the ground, bringing an even more eerie atmosphere. Lucifella was at this empty location, telling Crom that such a beautiful world and happiness in life just didn't make sense. Lucifella was looking at the results of the evil of this world and telling Crom that if he ever died, it would all lose its meaning. What the protagonist means is that he must protect Runabelt at all costs. The protagonist wept as she admitted that she missed her dead teacher. Crom wasn't amused either, so he kept quiet. Crom recalled that after Runabelt's teacher died, she never again smiled as genuinely and joyfully as she did when she first met him. Crom was greatly saddened by this and would give anything to make Lucifella smile and enjoy life again. For this reason, Crom did not hesitate to destroy anyone who in any way hindered Lucifella and blocked her path, for the smile of the queen was dearer to the sin of wrath than anything else in the world. Crom remained loyal to his queen even in the most difficult moments of his life, never forgetting her and only strengthening his affection for her. Sin of Wrath thought he would just wait for her rebirth in Runabelt, bringing beautiful flowers to the resting queen, but she still never showed up. This hit Crom's soul hard. The saddened and devoted servant remembered the words of his queen, who had told him that at best she would return to him in a day, and at worst in 3 years. Lucifella had promised that she would return to him in a new body. The flowers in the vase gradually wilted, but Crom did not despair and continued to believe that his efforts and patience were not in vain, for Lucifella had made him vow that she would return no matter what. Crom also recalls how he infiltrated the holy temple of Hesperia to kill the saint. The weather was clear that day, which made the temple look even more beautiful and white than it really was. Carefully memorizing the image of the saint, Crom pondered that the most humane and easiest way to kill the saint was magic, but the saints would be able to spot sorcery easily, so it would be better to do it with bare hands. While puzzling over ways to kill her, Crom noticed the boy George in the distance, who was insisting that the saint prepare her speech properly before the public appearance and final battle. At that moment, Crom felt as if struck by lightning, for he looked at the saint and gradually recognized her as Lucifella. The little girl capriciously answered Georg that she did not want to rehearse any speech, not even realizing that her most loyal friend was beside her. Crom saw before him not a saint, but little Lucifella, who also hated rote learning and being told what to do. It was then that Crom realized that his hunch was correct, and he had not come to Hesperia for the holy girl for nothing. For that reason, Crom only needed to see the saint to get an answer to every question he had. He knew at a glance that it was his dead queen he had waited so long for her habits and mannerisms had not changed in any way. A dark personality like Crom watched the two children in silence. Georg told the saint that she should not run away from him every time, but the saint only teased and teased him. That was how Crom remembered his little sister Lucifella, who always smiled and taught him about life. She was something more to him than just a person who gave him a sea of emotions and purpose in life. Afterwards, he remembered how the saint he already recognized Lucifella, as had scared him at the tournament when Crom saw her. Then he thought and asked her the question, why is she still not returning to Runabelt? What was stopping her from doing so? At that moment, Crom looked at her and assumed that she already had a chance to go home with Jack, who also recognized her as a queen. But had she forgotten about Runabelt? Watching Lucifella, Crom clenched his hand into a fist, for he thought it was likely that he no longer meant anything to his queen if she still didn't want to return to her homeland as she had promised in the past. Crom kept an eye on the saint even when she was asleep. He was still convinced that he was obligated to take her to Runabelt at all costs. That night, Lucifella in the saint girl's body cried again, and Crom wondered again who she was shedding her tears for so much. While Crom stood on the other side of the window, the saint, all in tears, told Sister Maria that she was having a nightmare. Maria supported the girl, saying that she could see perfectly well how frightened she was. Crom looked with sadness and devastation at Lucifella, who did not even remember him. Maria offered the saint a hug to comfort her. Looking at little Lucifella, who was crying into the arms of her kind and calm Sister Maria, Crom began to wonder if she was so happy in her new place, why would she return to Runabelt? Then Crom realized that he had better just as quietly leave as he had appeared in that place, because Lucifella would apparently never think of Runabelt, Jack, Beatrice, and Crom again. In addition to this, the saddened Sin of Wrath decided that just like the moment Lucifella pretended not to know him, Crom would also pretend to see the girl for the first time. Crom remembered sacrificing himself to save Lucifella from falling and dying, but at that moment he already doubted whether it was worth it and whether the saint would thank him later. While the holy girl was trying to call Crom by name, not realizing if he was all right, at that moment Crom muttered some words. He asked the girl not to do something, but the saintly girl, that is, Lucifella, still didn't understand what he meant. Then Crom looked at the saint with his angry look and told Lucifella to never call him by his name again, because they didn't know each other anymore. Lucifella had never expected such harsh, painful, and sharp words from someone she had known all her life and trusted with her business. Lucifella did not respond to Crom in any way that time, but in her silence, disappointment and sadness could be heard. Crom realized that he should throw away all his feelings and forget about Lucifella, for she, according to the sin of anger, no longer saw any value in him. Lucifella's faithful arch-rival realized that his queen was alive, but her gut was no longer what it used to be. Crom, it seems, was both angry at the queen and was in a deep sadness because of her that little would fix. Thus Crom realized that he had accomplished his mission, but did not expect its ending to be like this. After the dizzying events, Crom woke up on a soft bed in an unknown room. The guy opened his eyes, not intending to go anywhere in a hurry. By the bright interior of the room, where there was only him, surrounded by shelves of books and a desk, Crom realized that he was in the hospital of the Holy Temple. The injuries sustained from the saint falling on him had truly been serious, so it was no surprise that he was in such a place. Crom stood up from the bed, trying to look around the room. Strangely, there were no bandages or other medical intervention on his arms, but originally both of his arms were broken. Looking at his arm, Crom began to ponder. Molly did the day come when he fell unconscious from something. He didn't manage to recreate his thought fully, for his attention was caught by what was right beside him. Sleeping peacefully and sweetly on his bed was the saint that was Lucifella. She placed her small palm on Crom's finger, showing her worries and sympathy, but she had succumbed to exhaustion, and so fell asleep in the room with her longtime friend. Crom himself was surprised to notice the saint beside him. He thought that she didn't need him anymore, and that she wouldn't even want to see him, but it turned out not to be so. Crom couldn't be indifferent. He pressed his lip and tried not to cry as he continued to look at the pretty girl who didn't care about him. But then Crom noticed to his left another familiar figure appearing in his room. A holy father in baggy clothes was asking Crom if he had come to his senses yet. Turning his attention to the Holy Father, Crom immediately recognized him as the Holy Shield, Saint Bachman. At the time they had seen him, he had been quite young and strong, had fine hair and energy. But now, Bachman had a long beard and many wrinkles, but his kind face had not disappeared anywhere yet. Crom remembered that it would now be more correct to call Bachman Holy Father, a title he had received after the death of the Holy Prophet. Holy Father Bachman politely asked Crom how his hands were doing. He also added that they were completely intact because the saint had used her divine power on them. Crom continued to stare at the sleeping saint while the Holy Father told him that his hair had also been cured by the saint, giving it such volume and luster. But the dark mage no longer wished to stay in this place for long. The silent Crom looked at the saint with a kind of disdain, clenching his palm into a fist. He was clearly thinking about something, about to make a decision to leave this place. Letting go of the little saint's palm, Crom briefly and seriously told Saint Father Bachman that he was disqualified after all, and so there was no reason for him to stay here any longer. He got up from the bed and put some nice clothes on his body, telling Bachman that he would just leave. The Holy Father was still looking at Crom with a smile. After putting on his own clothes, Crom was about to leave the hospital as he walked past the Holy Father. But Bachman would certainly not let him disappear so quickly and instantly. Holy Father Bachman made Crom stop when he said that he had already heard his name somewhere. The Holy Father was about to continue speaking, turning his back to his departing interlocutor. Crom couldn't move a single step forward when he heard the Holy Father say those words. But the real shock to him was that Bachman thought he was very similar to his one acquaintance, which he said. Crom raised his eyelids in surprise, for he didn't think Bachman would ever recognize him. While Bachman was saying that he looked a lot like the man he knew earlier, he recalled the first time he met the man on the battlefield. Bachman recognized that too much time had passed since that moment. At the time of his first meeting with his longtime acquaintance, he was young and was a holy shield. At that moment, Bachman looked at that person with defeat. In front of him stood a dark magician whose hand was emitting blue, fiery magic. The sorcerer was also looking at Bachman with angry eyes. And while the Holy Father recalled this memory, he told Crom that the person he saw was the strongest of the strongest, so there was no mistaking him for another. The silent Crom realized that he was talking about him specifically. Bachman turned to his interlocutor to say something else, but the dark mage was already uncomfortable with it. Bachman admitted to Crom that when he had first seen him, he had thought that an old acquaintance had returned and his heart had throbbed. The Holy Father looked at Crom with kind blue eyes, but there was no emotion of joy, sadness, or anything else on Crom's face. He was not happy that his old enemy recognized him after many years, so he continued to remain silent while Bachman said that, in his opinion, his old acquaintance should have aged by now, just like himself. Crumb gradually got to know his enemy and realized that anything could be expected from this old man, even though he appeared to be an ordinary, kind, harmless old man. Also, despite his kind appearance, he had made Runabelt retreat more than once or twice by attacking his weaknesses. He used his gift of shield to inflict tremendous damage on Runabelt's mages, something Crumb remembered well. At the time, he was the very real holy shield that protected the saints and all people from Lucifella's arch-rival, and he was pretty good at it. Runabelt's plans would crumble whenever Bachman appeared in their path. But now Runabelt no longer had his own soldiers who were willing to give their lives for the queen. Crumb clenched his hand into a fist, realizing this, and he most likely held a grudge against Bachman because of it. Crumb did not reveal that he was the very familiar that Bachman recognized him as. Instead, he looked at the Holy Father with a serious face and said that he didn't quite know what he was talking about, for he only had to pretend. However, Father Bachman continued to look at Crumb as if he knew that Crumb was not telling him something. In addition, Bachman remained silent, trying to understand something or hear another of Crumb's words. The beautiful red sunset rays were falling in the room when, after awkward and tapered minutes of silence, Bachman said that he didn't really care who Crumb really was. All because Crumb had already protected their temple's treasure from death twice, meaning the Holy Girl. Crumb was slightly surprised at this turn of events, for he didn't think that this place would speak so well of him, much less his longtime enemy doing so. Bachman recognized that he couldn't repay him, even if he gave his life for it. But what happened next shocked Crumb even more. Bowing before him, Bachman said that he was asking him to stay, because that was what the Holy Jewel of Hesperia wanted. Crumb's face instantly veined with anger at Bachman, which he could barely contain. The fact that a man who couldn't even bow his head in his youth and now was asking him to stay in a foreign kingdom made him incredibly angry. Bachman never backed down on the battlefields. He was a stubborn and determined warrior who was the main reason for Runabelt's defeats. And now he easily asks for help for the sake of the Holy One from someone who is in fact his enemy. A stunned Crumb realizes that now that he will truly have to become his own personal knight, the task of taking the saint who is actually Lucifella to Runabelt has become several hundred times more difficult. Crumb is well aware and sees the way Bachman is being belittled for Lucifella's sake, and apparently it's because there's no way he can even express his devotion to the saint. But if things turn out this way, in Crumb's opinion, he has no choice but to respond with something else. Holy Father Bachman continued to hump his back in front of Crumb, hoping that he would agree to stay in Hesperia for the sake of the saint. But then Crumb asked him if he was referring to the sin of wrath when he mentioned his longtime acquaintance. The Dark Mage continued to remind him of the hero Mr. Bachman calls the strongest, while the Holy Father looked up to him, remembering that was the one he was referring to. Crumb said that Saint Father Bachman was trying to tell him about a battle where a holy shield faced an invincible sword in a fight for his own justice. Putting his hand to his chin and looking his interlocutor straight in the eye, Crumb said that that same invincible sword was one of the 7 scourges of Runabelt, which has the name Sin of Wrath. Crumb then asked Saint Father Bachman if he meant to say that Crumb resembled the sin of wrath he had recalled at the beginning of the conversation. Crumb was wary, for in trying to ward off suspicion, now Bachman could easily guess who he really was. Bachman stared at Crumb for a very long time as one thought after another swirled through his mind. He was silent on the answer, but it looked like he had an answer to that question. The reason he couldn't answer was that someone had interrupted him. Bachman and Chromis were interrupted by a saint who had been asleep on the bed, who got up, turned to the men, and said that she had dozed off and they had made such a noise that she had woken up. The saint wiped her eyes sweetly from sleep and slumber while Bachman asked if she was awake. In a sleepy voice, the girl replied that she was awake and continued to come to reality. The sweet girl told the Holy Father that her mouth was dry from her long sleep, to which Bachman graciously replied that he would now get her something to drink from the kitchen. And Crumb continued to watch the saint who is his queen. The Holy Father was already leaving the room with the saint and Crumb, having gone to fetch water, and Crumb escorted him with a look, realizing that their conversation had gone the wrong way. But perhaps it was for the best. Left alone with the queen, Crumb decided to approach the newly awakened saint and asked her how she had slept. But the little girl, wiping her eyes, apparently did not fully understand who she was talking to and looked at Crom in her sleep. Seeing before her the man with whom she had recently had an awkward situation, the holy girl was startled out of her wits, exclaiming that Crom's appearance was too sudden. But Crom continued to stand with an imperturbable face. The protagonist recalled that before she fell asleep, she had cured him with divine power. Remembering the past events that happened at the tournament, the heroine realizes that she is quite embarrassed to even talk to Crom after what happened, and she doesn't know where to start the awkward conversation. Crom looks his queen straight in the eyes as she tries to pick the first words to speak, not knowing what to say. They both realize that they know who they really are to each other. Crom breathed a sigh of relief and told Lucifella that he had been told that she was the reincarnation of a goddess, but in fact, as Crom said, she was just a normal child. The saint was so surprised that she didn't even believe what she heard. A look of genuine surprise appeared on her face, and she was preparing to question Crom about his last words. Asking Crom in shock, the girl angrily wanted to hear him answer where he had heard such a thing and who had said it to him. But Crom only replied that if such a thing was now called the power of a goddess, then she was no different from other children and he had only wasted his time saving her twice. The girl didn't even know what to say to the insolent Crom. Anger and resentment raged in her, but from amazement she continued to just keep silent with a dumbfounded face. Wanting to finish the saint with words, Crom said naively that he did not expect gratitude, and that he was a real idiot not to realize at once what a weak child she was. The girl's palms were already clenched with anger, when Crom naively admitted that he had probably overestimated the saint as a precious child of Hesperia, because her magic was ordinary. Boiling with anger, the saint, in whom the sharp character and soul of Lucifella lurked, shouted at Crom that what she knew, not even the teacher knew, so he had no right to say anything to her about it. But then Crom kneeled in front of the main character and said that the saint was truly her. Lucifella, who was already ready to tear Crom up with anger, stopped and didn't realize what he meant. Crom supplemented his words by saying that he recognized the saint as Lucifella, who was angry, teased, and resentful just like his deceased archmage years ago. Saint and Crom were still in the small room of the hospital, which had neat white walls and candlelights on them. Saint, after calming down a bit, asked Crom how he knew about it. Crom replied that there was no need even to guess here, for it was evident at once. He admitted that the murderous character and everything in Lucifella remained the same. The girl answered her old friend with rage and indignation that her murderous temper she was still trying to keep in check, but Crom didn't care about that, for he knew Lucifella better than anyone. But Crom suddenly confessed that he believed she would be resurrected someday. These words caused the saint to calm her anger and look at her friend with slightly surprised eyes. Crom also explained that he believed in her rebirth for the reason that Lucifella had personally promised him something that would definitely come back to him. The dark mage placed his hand on his chest, showing that his words were sincere. In addition to that, the Sin of Wrath asked his queen the most curious and important question, why she still hasn't returned to Runabelt. The saint calmed her anger, becoming serious. The holy girl put her head down and confessed to Crom that, in truth, she wanted to find her teacher's forbidden magic and only then return home. Crom asked her if she had found the magic. Lucifella shared the truth with her friend, saying that it was lurking somewhere in the temple, and Bachman wouldn't tell her about it, saying that the saint was still young for that. But after her adulthood, according to the protagonist, all the doors of the Holy Temple will be opened to her, as will all the capabilities of a saint, and then she will be able to explore every corner of the temple in search of the treasure. For this reason, the confused girl said that she needed to continue surviving in this body without knowing what kind of death awaited her. The saint clenched her hand into a fist, sharing the truth with Crom. Crom realized why Lucifella was in no hurry to return to her homeland, and why Jack hadn't taken her with him either. He looked at the heroine with a look that no longer held anger or resentment. Lucifella's sincerity helped Crom realize that she was still driven by the desire to find the magic that her teacher had told her about, and that Bachman was hiding, even when she had been reborn in the body of a holy girl. Realizing the situation, Crom, who had also calmed down with his desire to return the queen to Runabelt, took Lucifella's hand, telling her that if that was what was driving her, all he could do was follow her. He then, like a true gentleman and loyal servant to his queen, kissed the palm of the saint's hand, which surprised and slightly embarrassed the girl. Crom looked arch-rival Lucifella in the eyes and promised that he would be with her from the beginning to the very end, despite all the hardships, obstacles, and problems that would prevent the girl from achieving her goals. The girl didn't say anything back to Crom, though you could see from her face that she was grateful and surprised by her friend. The sunlight made her violet eyes even more beautiful as she looked at Crom, but the holy girl suddenly wondered if Crom would then return to Runabelt, which she asked him, but the blue-haired mage replied that he would not, saying that he had nowhere else to return to. However, the man who was standing behind the lovely couple said that in retelling the saint's words, she was saying that Crom was so dear to her that she didn't want to leave him, and she hoped that he would definitely stay in the temple. Crom also heard these words and pictured the little saint under them. Hearing someone behind them reveal her sincere words about Crom that she had once said, the protagonist asked Crom in shock, who had just said all this. The girl saw a cheerful Holy Father in the doorway, who was also embarrassed by the awkward situation. He was holding a tray of water and miscellaneous service, while the protagonist was ready to fall through the ground from embarrassment. Bachman, looking at how well Crom and the saint were talking, said that it looked like they had a lot to talk about in private. Again, the angry holy girl ran to Bachman to teach him a lesson, asking if he had just given away her words about Crom, and Crom only had to watch as his queen was again displeased about something. At the same time as the saint was beating Bachman's torso in expression of her displeasure, Crom realized that his queen was alive, the person whose appearance he had been waiting for continuously. Fortunately, the old man did not suspect anything yet. Crom realized that his beloved one was not just alive, but blossoming and growing in this world, something he longed for. It made him look at the saint and rejoice in life for the first time in a long time. It made the ever-silent and angry Crom laugh with happiness while the saint was dealing with Bauman. He wanted to cover his sincere smile with his hand, but he kept laughing. Like this over the holy temple, the Yaqui evening was already coming, in the hospital of which a displeased saint could already be heard, who wondered at Crom why he was laughing. And besides that, she promised that she would deal with all those who jeered at her. The next day, which was no less clear as all the previous ones, in the holy temple there were already some changes and changes for the better, which concerned the security of the protagonist. Crom was no longer dressed in the gloomy, dark, and sinister garb as before, but had the refined, light-colored attire worn by all the personal knights in the temple. Crom looks intently at the one before him. The one Crom was looking at turned out to be little George IV, who was also looking at his fellow saint's protection from threats. The two knights bowed to each other as Crom said that he was becoming the saint's personal knight from now on, also asking Georg to take care of her, for Georg was also her guard. The little boy was very curious to know Crom's real age, for no matter how much he looked at him, he could not figure out how old he was, for he looked very young, though experienced. Catching the moment when Crom bent down to the boy, Georg asked in a whisper if he could learn something from him. And after permission, George IV asked Crom how old he was, while the tall knight himself looked at him and remained silent. Crom calmly replied to the young boy that he was 18 years old, which Georg was shocked by, not realizing if he was joking or telling the truth. The boy interrogated Crom, asking him the "what" question. And this time Crom answered that it would be more accurate to say that he was currently 68. Jogray was even more surprised by his buddy's words, wondering rhetorically if he was too old. While George IV did not know how to recover from the shock, the two knights were approached by the paladin George III, who began the conversation with a smile, telling Crom that he was so confident. The paladin also said that some people would try to attack the saint again and they should take care of it. Meanwhile, the red-haired boy, who was thinking hard about how such a young-looking Crom could be 68, realized that he could be one of Runabelt's messengers, because the last one, the seducer, also looked suspicious. Unlike the boy, Crom pondered the saint and the problem of the assassination attempt on her. He said that this time there was no sign of an incoming invasion, so he thought and assumed that it was an inside job. Georg checked with Crom, asking if he meant that someone had his eye on the saint. Georg's dad, patting him on the head, told his son that it was also possible because not everyone liked the saintly girl. George III was telling everyone that they should make their enemies tell the protector of all this, but they won't even open their mouths yet. Crumb answered him with his thought that they need to find out their target, and that's their main task. But at this time, the door beside them opened ajar to reveal before them the one that the traitors in the temple are after. A saint appeared before the three knights who, without hesitation, continued the conversation, saying that given that the intruders mentioned Bachman, then apparently they want to take the next post of the Holy Father. The protagonist appeared before everyone in a soft blue, minimalistic dress and with her hair loose, but the girl's eyes were a beautiful violet color as always. Crumb did not take his eyes off the young holy girl, and the protagonist also could not pass by the new, snow-white image of her longtime friend, whom she always saw in dark clothes. The girl gave Crumb her bright and happy smile, saying that the new outfit suited him quite well. Crumb also thanked the girl for the compliment with a smile. Crumb leaned slightly towards the protagonist, asking her about who would benefit if the Holy Father were to step down. The saint replied that such a candidate could be Brother Omar, as he is right after the Holy Father in the hierarchy. While the heroine and Crumb were talking to each other, Georg felt embarrassed that they knew each other so well, and yet they did not speak to him. The saint went on to tell Crumb that they had a strange and shining type like Omar in their palace. In addition to that, she told those present that he was not stupid, so they should be careful not to get caught by him. At this moment, the girl started rubbing her forearms, showing that she was a bit chilly in the room. Little George was about to take off his cloak to throw it over the frozen saint, but if he had known what was going to happen next, he would not have done so. At the same moment that the boy was about to throw his cloak over the girl, he noticed Crumb had already taken off his own cloak and was already holding it out to the heroine. This caused Georg to pause and be slightly surprised. As expected, Crumb was able to realize faster than Georg that Saint was freezing and put the cloth over her. The saint said she was still chilly, but she still thanked Crumb for her concern. Georg was in amazement, showing everyone his surprised face. He was already holding his blue cloak that he wanted to give to the saint, but it was no longer necessary. The shame made the boy feel as awkward as possible. The feeling of awkwardness became more and more when Crumb and the protagonist looked at him with bewilderment. Georg has many questions, but the main one is how does Crumb know the saint so well? Little Georg recalls that he was the saint's protector for 5 years of her life, never leaving her side, watching her gradually grow and learn everything, so he should be the one who knows the saint best. But Crumb, who has only known the protagonist for 5 weeks, knows her and understands her better than Georg, who is shocked by this. Crumb understands her literally from half a word. But taking care of the saint is not just about guarding her. Georg remembers that it is also about checking the food, checking the saint's schedule, keeping an eye on her surroundings. And all of this is brilliantly performed by Crumb, not Georg. And if you also remember Crumb's mastery of the sword, which is what the boy is thinking, you can assume that there's nothing he can't do. Georg realizes that Crumb is strong, polite, and generally a good man. But against him, the boy feels like an extra, as if he has no place here anymore. Little Georg only has to stand there with his cloak in his hands, not understanding where he should go. Eventually, Georg said he felt a little bad and asked to be excused for the day. The saint was worried about him, thinking he was in physical pain, which she asked him about. But Georg answered her nothing, trying to hide his embarrassment. The boy didn't want to tell everyone that he felt superfluous. Suddenly, Georg IV rushed to the exit, shouting to everyone that if he rested a bit, everything would go away. After saying goodbye to everyone, the boy left Chroma, the saint, and his father. Georg could not hold back his tears as he left the company and went out into the corridor. He walked and cried, thinking about the fact that the saint was really worried about him, and he had to lie about his condition. While Georg's father excitedly begged forgiveness for his son's abrupt departure, the saint and Crumb talked about what kind of pretense Georg had just observed. After this strange moment, Crumb fed Saint a sweet dessert of strawberries. As she ate bite by bite, the saint couldn't figure out if Georg was really sick or if he was just exhibiting strange behavior that she couldn't explain. Crumb only remained silent at the saint's words, continuing to feed her dessert. But after a while, he confessed to the girl that if Beatrice knew that he was here, would definitely burn with envy. The saint ate pieces of dessert and continued the conversation, saying that Beatrice whimpered every time she realized that the queen loved only Crom, and he always helped her in everything and was a support. Crom picked up on the fact that George was acting out now for much the same reason. The saint asked him if he really thought so. If he had the chance, he would have told Saint his opinion. But Crom realized that it was none of his business, and he would not guess at Georg's feelings until he had something to say about it himself. The saint had managed to eat all the dessert, and Crom put his fork down on the empty plate where there were only crumbs. He decided to continue the conversation about the criminals in the Holy Temple by asking the protagonist if she thought Omar was the main intruder. The saint replied that he has the most power, but he is not the kind of person Crom thinks he is. The protagonist also added that Omar is very busy with his work lately. The heroine even admits that she heard that he is having accounting problems again. The little girl finishes her tea from a serving mug while Crom tells her that they are right back where they started. What Crom meant was that the problems with his accounting reports and the frequent attempts on Saint's life could be directly related. But then the saint asked her personal knight an interesting and useful question, asking him what he would do in the perpetrator's shoes in this situation. At first, Crom hesitated, trying to imagine the answer. Crom answered the saint that after 2 unsuccessful attempts to kill the saint, her security had been beefed up. So many opportunities to finish her off were gone. The attackers need to look for another method to overthrow the authorities. Crom then visualized the holy girl as a shining and beautiful holy tree that grew in the garden. So the dark mage kept thinking on what would he do if he couldn't even touch it with his finger? Looking at his reborn queen, Crom replied that in that case he would not try to attack her, but the people around her and those she holds dear. Her friend's words made the girl hesitate, pondering who the criminals might attack if she was now fully protected. Remembering her sister Maria, the girl said that she was constantly in the company of other people, one could say around the clock, so the intruders certainly cannot get close to her. Then the girl thought of St. Father Bachman and Chroma, but they too are crossed off this list, because in this case, on the contrary, a miracle will happen if the intruders remain alive after their strength. While the saint was puzzling over which of her entourage could be attacked by the intruders, George IV was walking down the hallway and weeping at the recent events. He still felt like he was an extra there, and the thought made him let tears fall. But the boy's carefree stroll through the temple corridors was about to be interrupted by those who appeared behind him. Georg did not suspect anything yet, wiping away his tears, but the unknown men were coming closer and closer to him. And while the intruders were already reaching out their vile hands to the crying boy, the saint still thought that no one would dare to attack George IV. But unfortunately, that is exactly what happened. After a time had passed, George was kidnapped and placed in an unknown room that was dark and contained objects such as boxes and barrels. The room looked more like a warehouse, and Georg was dragged into this room screaming to the intruders to let him go. The evil kidnappers shone a kerosene lamp in Georg's face while he kept urging them to solve everything peacefully. But all the little boy's pleas were in vain. By the light of the oil lamp, Georg, bound with a rope, saw a clerk in front of him who angrily apologized to him for meeting him in this way. In addition to the servant, there were some of his charges in the room. Thanks to the light, Georg was also able to see the face of the one speaking to him. Saying that they were a little late in greeting him, the man introduced himself as Enby and said that he served Mr. Omar faithfully. Georg could not hide his excitement. A drop of sweat was running down his face, and his expression was not relaxed. He realized that all intruders were not just people. The boy guessed that all of them are priests in the Holy Temple who secretly serve only Omar. They all looked at Georg with malicious smiles, about to learn all the valuable information from him. Being bound and twitching from side to side, Georg asked the traitor priests if they were guilty of all the attempts to kill the saint, to which the most important of them replied that killing was the best method in the fight to save the temple from the witch in the mask of the saint. George IV looked at the kidnappers with anger, but he also did not understand why they called the saint a witch. The word made the boy awaken some memories. The little boy recalls that he only knew one woman that everyone called a witch. The calamity known to all that divided the continent into 4 kingdoms is her handiwork. She appeared to burn the holy city of Asperia to the ground. The boy recalls that she is the worst witch on the entire continent. But one question continued to plague the boy. Shouting at Enby's kidnapper, George aggressively asked him why he dared to call the saint a witch and how he could allow himself to treat her like that. To this, Andy responded by saying that he certainly assumed he was naive, but not to the extent that he sees it. Then Amby asked Georg a question that gave his eyes an instant shock. The kidnapper asked the boy if she was really a saint in his eyes. Georg didn't even know what to answer. The boy began to ponder that, understandably, the saint is an unusual person. She looks like a child, but her words and actions are just like adults. Georg put the puzzles together, realizing that only someone who had lived a very long life could behave this way. While the boy can't get away from the intruder's shocking words that the saint is actually a witch, Andy tells him that everything is a plot by Bachman to become a saintly father. The kidnapper's frank confession finally threw the boy off balance. He had no idea that Bachman could do such a thing, but he wasn't going to take Enby's word for it. Georg looked at Enby's kidnapper in shock as he also told him that she was no saint, and it was obvious that Bachman had brought the wrong child to be a saintly father. The boy is not only surprised that the kidnapper knows so much, he is also curious as to why he spoke so harshly about Bachman, switching from the saint to him. Wanting to know the truth, Georg asks Enby if their claims are based on the fact that Bachman set everything up to become a saintly father. Enby replied that it was, and that if it wasn't for him, Omar would have had no problem taking the place of the Holy Father. To this, George once again asked the intruder if the fact that Omar had set it all up meant that he was the one who had set it all up. But Enby replied that it did not, for he only wanted money, which he was obsessed with. As Enby was vigorously telling the kidnapped boy that they were going to get rich by making Omar a saintly father, two employees who were standing behind whispered about whether Enby was revealing too much information to George. Enby explained and told the boy that this was the plan they had come up with, and Georg, according to the kidnapper, would give them the decisive hand of overthrowing the Pope and taking over the temple. But Georg wasn't even wearing a face. While Enby was persuading Georg to agree to their arrangement, the boy thought that Mr. Bachman had no ambition or greed and was completely devoted to his work in the temple. Then Georg thought of Omar, who also devotes himself to work, but he is interested in money, which is always not enough for him. What then do the kidnappers want, and are they telling the truth? The boy shouted angrily at the intruders that they were manipulating him, as if the saint was truly a witch. The well-mannered Georg decided not to take people at their word. Enby looked at Georg, who was aggressively yelling at them that they were talking nonsense, saying that the saint was a witch. The chief kidnapper was preparing to use brute physical force on the boy to force the unfortunate man to their side. The evil Enby roughly took the boy by the collar, lifted him easily, and put him against the wall, silencing him. But the boy's opinion would be hard to change. The kidnapper smilingly told Georg that he six was curious if he would find common ground with them, but according to Enby, Georg no longer listened to him. Behind his back, Omar's follower held a sharp and large dagger, preparing to use it on the boy. The sharp dagger was already closing in on Georg while the intruders were all smiling slyly, about to force Georg to tell them a lot of information and follow them in general. Georg pierced the kidnappers with his angry golden eyes as they said that they were about to kill the faithful dog of the saint with just one blow, for he was of absolutely no use to them. But the overbearing kidnappers were never able to dispose of the little boy. Suddenly, a bright, blinding light appeared in the room where the servants were with George. Enby was surprised and even frightened, wondering what had just happened. Enby already wanted to straighten up the boy, holding him by his clothes, but the sudden light and noise caused him to turn around, asking in shock what was going on. Georg didn't understand the situation either, so he too wished to see what had happened. Behind them, the mortals, along with Georg, saw Crom in snow-white clothes, who was able to break through the wall, thus creating such a light. He was already pulling out his long sword, saying that if there is a long tail, it is bound to be stepped on. But it turns out that was half the surprise. A worried Omar appeared behind Crom's back, pointing his finger at the intruders, announcing that it was these people who had tampered with his accounting. Upon hearing this, Enby had a look of shock on his face that no one had ever seen before. He realized that at this point he would no longer be able to hide anything, for the secrets had already been revealed. With one wave of his hand, Crom was able to push Ambi away from Georg without much trouble, so that he even dropped his dagger. Georg marveled at that, as much as he marveled that Crom had managed to find it at all. Crom untied the frightened boy while Georg asked him how he had managed to find him. The Dark Knight replied that the intruders had left obvious signs of kidnapping, and so he was able to find him quickly. But Crom also said that it was all thanks to the Saint, for she herself had led the search. This made the boy think, because he realized that the Saint was worried about him. Calmly, Crom held out his sword to the young man, which he had also brought for the boy to fight back against his abusers. In that moment, George IV realized that he must continue to defend the Saint despite any circumstances. The reclined Ambi held his head, barely able to rise after Crom's blow. Meanwhile, his underlings had already bared the blades of their swords to begin the fight. The Dark Knight told Georg not to interfere, for he could deal with them himself. But Georg was not going to lie on the floor and wait to be rescued and protected from the villains. Overwhelmed with motivation to avenge the Saint, he stood up from his seat, determined to say that he didn't want to sit still. Preparing his sword for battle, Georg said he could not stand by when a saint was insulted right in front of his nose, and for that reason he too wanted to defend the honor and pride of the Jewel of Esperia. Crom praised the boy, who had a lot of motivation raging in him, though he still wasn't overly emotional and just looked at him with gray eyes. But unlike Crom, George's eyes read courage, determination, and fortitude before a fair battle against those who wanted to kill the saint several times over. For the next few minutes, Omar watched as Georg, along with Crom, dealt with each intruder, causing them to scream for help and run away in fear. Omar realized that such a grand event, which was overflowing with dizzying twists and turns, justice and dignity, was worthy of being immortalized in memoirs, which he intended to do in the near future. Thus were caught those who had made several attempts on the life of the holy girl. Every one of them was apprehended with their hands tied. Ambi, as well as his buddies, received many bruises and bruises from Crom and Georg, who took revenge on them for bad words in the direction of the saint. Afterward, the protagonist was quickly informed that Georg had been rescued and found virtually unharmed. The saint even smiled with joy, realizing that everything had become good. The incident with the attempts on the saint's life were completely resolved thanks to the teamwork of the saint, Chroma, and Georg, who caught the attackers red-handed. But no matter what the fights are like, Georg still needs and wants to train. So, after getting in shape, he was already practicing wooden sword fighting with Crom, who has a lot of experience in it. Once again, Crom defeated Georg IV by making him fall down and throw his sword aside. Crom held the wooden sword at Georg, looking at him with nonchalant eyes, suggesting that he had won the training battle. Georg, of course, was lying on the ground, but you couldn't see Toph from him that he was regretting the defeat, but rather the opposite. He was smiling, admiring Crom's skills. Little George confessed to Crom that he was genuinely fascinated by the knight's strength and was glad that he had not met him as his enemy. Crom was surprised, for he thought the young boy would be upset about the defeat. Crom then decided to ask the boy if there was another reason he wanted to fight him. Georg looked at his teacher and already knew the answer to that question. Georg replied with a smile that he was actually jealous of him, for the swordsmanship skills Crom possessed impressed him greatly. The boy admitted that in this case, he is as far from him as walking to the moon to train. But despite all this, according to the boy, he would like to fight with Crom without any regrets. Georg said these words with sincerity, looking at the new teacher. Crom was even more surprised by the boy's words, because no one has ever admitted it to him, especially when he is one of the 7 sins of Runabelt that everyone hates. Crom picked himself up a little. Crom reached out to Georg to help him up, while he himself said that the saint knows very well how hard Georg is trying, and that is why she needs him. The young boy listened to Crom with his mouth ajar. The fencing class ended when Crom, still holding out his hand, suggested that the boy go to the saint, for they should not leave her alone for a long time. Crom thinks about the fact that he knew Lucifella in her former form, and he grew up with her together. Holding out his hand to Georg, crying with happiness, the dark mage realized that their desires to protect her are converging, which is a very good thing. With this uplifted mood, the boy accepted Crom's help and took his hand. The boy's new friend reminded him that the saint was waiting for them at the holy temple. Meanwhile, in Rhonabel, thanks to the newspapers, the news had already arrived that the faithful knight had followed the saint, and the wonderful news was spread all over the continent. The town was finally at peace. Impossibly angry, Beatrice clutched with her hand all the newspapers with happy news, not understanding why he saved the saint and became her faithful knight. She thought with horror, had he really betrayed Rhonabel? Beatrice, who radiated a poison-green flame, said angrily to herself that this would not just go away. The unknown boy, Crom, and the saint would definitely pay for everything, ending the times of peace for Esperia. While in Rhonabel, Beatrice promised to overthrow the entire kingdom. Crom once again recalled a long-ago memory involving Lucifella. He remembered a beautiful summer day when they had walked together through a street food fair. The vendor was handing Lucifella his delicious balls while the girl said she was willing to bet this diner wasn't even 50, but 100 years old. The children held the goodies in their hands, while Lucifella told little Crom that, in her opinion, this diner would be standing for a long time to come and wouldn't even shake. Crom admired the street fair and sadly realized that he would love to be with Lucifella at this place in his next life, also eating delicious food and walking the streets. But for today, Crom had also had the opportunity to walk through the streets he had walked with Lucifella many years ago. He was now 18 or 68, as he said, but he still chose to walk the familiar streets even now. After ordering himself some warm milk with the same marbles, Crom, wearing a concealed hoodie, sat in the diner and enjoyed the familiar food while sipping milk from a white cup. As Crom was drinking the warm milk, he was approached by a polite cook, telling him thank you for coming to their store again. On top of that, the salesman called Crom a sin of anger, as if he had known him for a long time. Crom decided to reply to his longtime acquaintance that he should be the one saying thank you to him, because thanks to him, he was able to participate in the tournament without any doubts or suspicions. The seller of goodies smiled sincerely at Crom, but the kind seller replied that he hadn't done anything for which he should be thanked. Besides, N is always willing to do anything for his benefactor, which is what he told Crom. The other vendor explained to Crom that he was not just a person for them to thank, but he, like all witches and mages, was a hero who had saved them from the terrible emperor. Crom thought about what Lucifella would do if she heard such words, for she was worried about those she could not save. The dark mage recalled in his mind the staff of the first Holy Father, which had been broken and destroyed. After words of thanks, a vendor placed a sliced melon on Crom's table, serving it with skewers stuck in it to make it convenient to eat. The vendor said that Crom must have gotten hungry while getting here, so the vendor told the dark mage to eat as much as he wanted before leaving. The salesman also asked if he enjoyed such a treat. Another consultant noticed that his colleague, who is his father, was treating a guest with such an expensive product and resented it, but the father objected to his son that he would not spare anything for such a guest, not even melons. While the father was scolding his son for his rude behavior, Crom was looking intently at the treat the vendors had given him. He took one piece of fruit in his hands, thinking about the fact that melon was not such an expensive product before, and after all, it is just a fruit, which contains neither flavor nor useful microelements, according to Crom. Crom looked at the melon and did not understand one thing. Why did it suddenly become an exclusive product only for guests? It was an uncountable, beautiful, and clear day in Esperia when Saint grew up in the Holy Palace together with Crom, Georg, Bachmann, and other personalities of the mansion. The saint was once again running joyfully down the hallway, hurrying to her meal. She was wearing miniature pink shoes, which she stomped all over the palace. One of the servants, who was holding papers in his hand, noticed the hurrying saint and told her with a smile and surprise that she had come much earlier than he thought. The servant then invited the saint to sit down at the table. The other servants also said that the saint had done well in class today, and the servant happily wished the girl a pleasant appetite before the meal. The saint, who had already grown noticeably taller and whose hair had become even longer, thanked everyone happily, saying that she would now eat with pleasure. While the protagonist, humming melodies, began to eat, the servants watched the girl with amusement, and one of them even asked if the others thought that every year their saint was getting cuter and cuter. One servant replied that this was true, and thanks to the girl's magical smile, he felt completely healthy. But suddenly the conversations of several servants were interrupted by a knight who hurried to the saint and asked her to wait. The maids were even surprised, because usually no one appears like that. The knight turned out to be Georg, who had also grown considerably, or, as the maid said, blossomed right before their eyes. Georg had been looking for the saint in the temple all this time, and at last he found her. The boy resented the saint, for she had gone off alone again, and today she has only one guard, so she must be guarded round the clock. But the protagonist only replied that it was his own fault if he was so slow. A brown-haired maid with a satisfied face was doting on Georg, saying that she couldn't wait for him to grow up and become even more handsome. One servant actually said that he thought Georg was the most handsome in the temple, but upon hearing this, a blonde-haired servant nearby turned his attention to them. The white-haired servant pointed his index finger and said that when it came to beauty, Crom was second to none, for he still remembered the beautiful view he had seen recently. The servant was referring to the occasion when he went to Crom's room with a tray to serve food. He knocked at his door and called out, saying he had brought breakfast for him, but no one would come out. The servant already thought he was not in the room at all. But the young servant was mistaken, for immediately afterward the door opened and he saw Crom, who seemed to be unclothed. But it did not appear to the servant. In front of him, covering his head with a towel, stood Crom, who was as a bare, embossed torso. Seeing this, the servant realized that he had seen something he should not have seen, from him incredibly surprised. The servant was literally dazzled by Crom's beauty. He smiled and could not admire, trying not to drop the breakfast that brought the night. The satisfied servant said that many years had passed since that moment, but he still couldn't forget that image. The other servants were shocked by his words, embarrassed and even envious of their colleague. The saint at this time could hear the gossip of the company of servants perfectly well, telling Georg that she could hear the beginnings of a new couple being discussed. But then something else caught the saint's attention. Looking at the table, the saint noticed that there was a little less food on the table than usual. For example, there were no scrambled eggs and sausage or salad on the table, but there was spaghetti and pie. The saint told Georg about this, and the boy was surprised too. The girl was indignant because there was no melon on the table, her favorite melon, and she couldn't resist it anymore. Georg said that the girl already eats a lot of it, and it is also a useless product, so nothing will happen to her if she doesn't eat it once. The girl was unrealistically outraged when she heard Georg say such bold and nasty words about her favorite fruit in the world. The enraged saint pounced on Georg IV and began to crush his cheek, shouting that there was a lot of happiness in a melon because it was unrealistically delicious. The girl kept up with the boy, begging him to give her the melon immediately. After receiving chastisement from the saint, George gently said that at the moment the melon had gone up in price a lot, which is why it was not on the saint's table. But the saint continued to vent her outrage on Knight George, not understanding what was so expensive about the melon. She said that they were not so poor that they could not afford to buy such a cheap fruit. At this point, the girl paused with her accusations, for she realized something. She asked George if anything else had happened at the temple, but the lad was in no hurry to answer her at once. Turning to the girl, George waved his hands and uncertainly said that the saint had nothing to worry about, because in fact, nothing special had happened, but the protagonist realized that something was wrong here. The girl had already heard these words so many times that she was fed up. She continued to look at George, who clearly lied to her, and it alarmed her. The protagonist recalls that in all of her rebirths it was such that she died before she became an adult, and because of that, her entire life consisted of childhood. Lucifella was destined by fate to live a childhood every time, which more often than not was not overflowing with happiness, fun, love, and carefree. For this reason, it didn't matter to the girl what kind of life she lived, because she always didn't have a chance to grow up and gain experience. It seemed to her that Saint's life would be different, but in the end, this life was no different. The Saint thought about it and continued to stare intently into Georg's eyes, but the boy still wanted to hold on and not tell her the truth. A pink mark was left on the young man's cheek from the heroine teasing his cheek. But Georg still couldn't settle before the silent gaze of the saint. He reprimanded her not to make that expression when he looked at her, for now he would tell her everything. The little saint was surprised, prepared to hear the truth, but Georg first warned her that it had nothing to do with the temple, for there was another problem. Then George handed the girl a newspaper, saying that if she read it, she would find the answers to all her questions and would be able to understand what was going on. The saint took the newspaper and prepared to read it. When she started reading the newspaper, the girl did not understand anything yet, which was evident from her face. But gradually, the protagonist began to understand the problem with the melon she loved so much. While the heroine learned many things from the newspaper she received in the main castle of Runabelt, the city of mages and disasters, it was not quiet and smooth either. In Beatrice's office, Jack aggressively threw papers on her desk that are most likely the same newspaper. One thing you can tell from Jack's behavior is that he is clearly unhappy about something. Jack angrily asked Beatrice, who is the new ruler of the town of Runabelt, if these unpleasant papers and the news in it were her handiwork. Beatrice did not even hurry to answer her irritated pal. She only looked at him with her snake eyes, interrupting what she was reading earlier. Ever since she was a little girl, arrogant, Beatrice knew that she was a gifted child who deserved better. The other children constantly praised her and told her she was the best. Adults also constantly praised her for even the smallest of accomplishments, telling her that she was just a wonderful child and there was nothing she couldn't do. This made the girl's self-esteem skyrocket. Beatrice grew up in eternal praise and care, thanks to which she became the person who constantly wants to be in the center and get the best, and if she does not succeed, she will be incredibly jealous and angry. The girl was born into a family of aristocrats, where she was cherished all her life, making her think that she should always be in first place in everything, because everyone thought that she was talented from birth. Being the best was taken for granted, so she knew that she would never give in to anyone and become the best mage in the world. But in reality, Beatrice lived like a frog in a well. One day she realized that she wasn't the best at everything. Her magic wand had broken to pieces, and she herself sat on her knees and didn't understand why she felt she had lost. Whoever had defeated her that time had said he wasn't interested in persecuting civilians. The world was crumbling before Beatrice's eyes, for she had found a man who was better, more agile, and stronger than her. She looked at the one who had won her battle and could not understand how this was possible. In front of her stood a mage who was several times stronger than her. She couldn't even believe it, because all her life she had thought that the most talented person in the world was herself. Beatrice realized that Lucifella, who had defeated her in the magic battle, was not even several times, but several tens of times stronger than her in magic, and she was superior even to everyone else. At that moment, she couldn't even utter words from the anger, envy, and shock that overflowed her head. She clenched her palm into a fist, which already had veins protruding from anger. Beatrice looked at Lucifella as her truest enemy, showing her displeasure, anger, and jealousy. She cringed just at the thought that someone was stronger than her in magic. But Lucifella continued to stare into her angry face, expecting her rival to simply accept defeat. And at the same time, she saw in Beatrice a hidden great potential. That was exactly what Beatrice had grown up to be, the one who was now the ruler of Runabelt, and who Jack had now come to ask for the papers. Sin of Lust put the papers on the table, which had headlines about melon being trash, bad for your health, and about it being a precious fruit that only a saint buys up for herself. It was evident from Beatrice's face that she did not quite understand what Jack was telling her. She looked at him with a slightly perplexed face. After Beatrice asked Jack what was wrong with these papers, the guy told her that they were the real fake news, made to her order. Jack grudgingly and angrily said that he knew very well that she was picking melon from all over the continent, and because of that its price had gone up several times. Then Jack asked the green-haired girl why she was making such a mockery of the saint, but Beatrice calmly drank a glass of wine and was in no hurry to answer her friend. But when Jack mentioned Crom, saying that even he had sent them a letter asking them not to touch the saint, Beatrice seemed mad with anger and raised her eyelids upward. Just because of the mention of Chromis in the conversation, Beatrice clutched the wineglass in her hand, causing it to shatter at the same second. Beatrice, flaming green with anger, told Jack not to even talk about Crom. A frightened Jack stood still, not wanting to say anything. The green-haired girl angrily explained to Jack that Crom was the very real traitor who had saved the saint several times. It was for this reason that Beatrice was infuriated by even the slightest mention of him. Blazing with anger, Beatrice reminded him that Jack liked the saint too, but she didn't touch him because at least he stayed in Runabelt, not like Crom. Clenching her hand into a fist, which was bleeding badly from the shards of glass, Beatrice told Jack firmly and threateningly that she was the one with the power right now. And that was why Beatrice said that she was now the ruler of Runabelt, and Jack must follow her words unquestioningly. The new ruler of Runabelt glared at Jack with her crazy eyes. And if Jack wanted to air his grievances, Beatrice advised Jack to first deal with all the documents on his desk, and only then, according to Beatrice, could they talk. Jack was quickly forced to sign all the documents at the desk while Beatrice poured more paper on him, and while Jack whined about how he was just pretty and he shouldn't be doing this. Eventually, Beatrice would leave, telling a working Jack that since Crom had disappeared from the castle, a lot of work had piled up that he usually did. But now, according to the green-haired sorceress, that work belonged to Jack and he was obligated to do it. Looking at Beatrice, who was always angry, Jack decided not to bother her, realizing that doing so would only make things worse. Jack continued to work on the documents, thinking that Crom must protect the queen, no matter what happened on the island. These thoughts calmed the sin of lust a little. But Jack wondered about one nuance. Did the queen remain the same, or did she not retain her former self? Meanwhile, in the Holy Temple, the saint was already reading the strange papers that George had given her. She was shocked, for half of the news in the papers were lies. The saint asked Georg in amazement when she had recommended the melon as written in the paper. Georg said nothing about it, but reminded her that she eats it every day, and that is a fact. Georg also told the girl that nowadays, melon is one of the most expensive products. Besides, recently a thief broke into the Holy Temple and took absolutely all the melon from the palace. So Georg said that the saint would have to make do with other fruits for the time being. The saint only frowned, muttering something unhappy under her breath. Still, the little girl ate the fruit with difficulty, thinking that it was not as bad as she had thought before. Her attention, however, was caught by Georg, who was standing beside her, and at whom the little girl looked with her sly gaze. Meanwhile, Georg was already planning to leave the sant, remembering that he was soon to be replaced by Crom. But quite unexpectedly, he could not leave, for someone came at him from behind with all his might. The boy turned around in the same moments, not realizing what was the matter. A saint had been thrown on Georg's back and had clung to his neck in joy, which made Georg frightened and shocked at the same moment. The girl pounced on Georg while the boy asked in amazement what was going on. Saint replied that she wasn't asking anything of him. She just wanted to know how he knew all the news about the melon if the temple had a supply of the fruit. The saint made George stammer while she herself naively wondered if by any chance her knight wanted to stock up on melon so his saint wouldn't be upset that she wasn't there. The protagonist asked the boy if what she was guessing was true. The protagonist made Georg embarrassed to the point of redness, for she had revealed his secret plan to procure the melon. The boy had already prepared to refute everything the saint said. While the saint was fooling around and Georg was shouting that all the girl's words were not true, Crom entered their room and turned his attention to everyone, apologizing for the disturbance. Crom caught a picture that was incomprehensible to him. The holy girl was holding on to Georg's shoulders and begging Crom to catch him quickly, while the small red-haired knight was only embarrassed even more by the girl's tactility.